Somewhere in the volcanic plains of southeastern Australia, buried under centuries of grass and silence, there are stone walls, not scattered rocks, not natural formations, carefully placed, deliberately engineered walls of basalt that once formed the foundations of permanent houses. Houses where families lived, where children were born, where communities gathered for thousands of years before the first Egyptian pharaoh ever drew breath. And almost nobody knows they exist. For more than 200 years, the story of Australia before European arrival has been told in the same way. A vast, empty continent, nomadic people wandering from place to place, no cities, no agriculture, no permanent structures, just hunter-gatherers drifting across the oldest landmass on Earth, unchanged and unchanging for 60,000 years. That story is wrong. Not partially wrong, not slightly misleading. Fundamentally, deeply, structurally wrong. Across this continent, from the volcanic stone country of Victoria to the ancient river systems of New South Wales, from the lush wetlands of the southwest to the red desert interior, there is evidence of something that should have rewritten every history textbook on the planet. Stone cities, engineered waterways, aquaculture systems older than Stonehenge, astronomical observatories built from carefully positioned rocks, grain storage facilities, permanent villages with populations in the hundreds, agricultural systems so sophisticated that the first Europeans who encountered them could barely comprehend what they were looking at. And then, in the space of a single generation, almost all of it was gone. Erased, not by time, not by nature, by something far more deliberate, far more devastating, and far more recent than anyone wants to admit. If you are new here, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this every single week, and there is so much more to uncover about the history that was hidden in plain sight. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss what comes next. Now, let us go back, way, way back, to a time before the written word existed anywhere on Earth. And let us start with the place where the evidence is so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even the institutions that spent centuries ignoring it were finally forced to pay attention. Number one, the Buj Bim aquaculture system, the oldest engineering project in human history. In the far southwest corner of the Australian state of Victoria, there is a dormant volcano called Buj Bim. The Gunditjmara people have lived in its shadow for longer than most civilizations have existed. Their oral histories describe the formation of the volcano itself, the moment when the earth cracked open, and molten rock poured across the landscape, reshaping the rivers and the wetlands and the entire geography of the region. Geologists have dated that eruption to roughly 30,000 years ago. The Gunditjmara remember it. They have songs about it. Stories passed down through more generations than most people can even conceptualize. But the eruption is not the remarkable part. What happened after is, when the lava cooled, it created a landscape of dark basalt stone, porous and rough, perfect for building. And the Gunditjmara built. They did not just build shelters. They did not just stack rocks for windbreaks. They engineered an aquaculture system so complex, so carefully planned, so precisely constructed, that when archaeologists finally began to study it in detail in the early 2000s, they struggled to find anything comparable anywhere else on the planet. The system worked like this. The Gunditjmara carved channels through the basalt, connecting natural waterways and wetlands into an integrated network of canals, ponds, and weirs. These channels directed water flow across the landscape, creating artificial ponds where eels could be trapped, bred, and harvested. The channels were not random. They were engineered with an understanding of water flow, seasonal flooding, and aquatic biology that would impress a modern hydrologist. Some of the channels stretch for hundreds of meters. Some are lined with carefully placed stones to prevent erosion. Some include weirs, small dam-like structures made from woven baskets and stone, designed to regulate water levels and control the movement of eels through the system. The baskets were made from local plant fibers, woven into specific shapes that allowed water to pass through while trapping eels of a particular size. Smaller eels could slip through and continue growing. Larger eels were caught and harvested. It was selective fishing on an industrial scale thousands of years before the concept of sustainable fisheries management existed anywhere else. And the scale of this system is what truly sets it apart. This was not a single pond and a couple of channels. The Budj Bim aquaculture network spans more than 100 square kilometers, 100 square kilometers of engineered waterways, artificial ponds, stone-lined channels, and carefully maintained wetlands. That is larger than many modern cities. It is a landscape-scale engineering project that was designed, built, maintained, and operated continuously for at least 6,600 years. 6,600 years. Let that time frame settle in your mind for a moment. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built roughly 4,500 years ago. The oldest known cities in Mesopotamia date to around 5,000 years ago. The Budj Bim system predates them all. It is, by a significant margin, the oldest known aquaculture system on Earth, and potentially the oldest known engineering project of any kind. The eels harvested from this system were not just eaten locally. They were smoked and preserved using techniques that allowed them to be traded across vast distances. Smoked eel from the Budj Bim region has been traced through trade networks extending hundreds of kilometers inland, connecting the Gunditjmara to dozens of other Aboriginal groups across southeastern Australia. This was not subsistence fishing, this was an economy, a production system with surplus, preservation, and long-distance trade. The Gunditjmara did not just harvest the eels, they managed the entire ecosystem. They used controlled burning to maintain the grasslands around the wetlands, ensuring that the vegetation did not encroach on the channels. They planted specific species of rushes and sedges along the channel banks to stabilize them. They monitored water levels and adjusted the weirs according to seasonal conditions. They understood the breeding cycles of the eels and timed their harvesting to ensure the population remained stable year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. In 2019, the Budj Bim cultural landscape was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It was recognized not for its natural beauty, not for its geological significance, but for its cultural value as evidence of one of the oldest and most extensive aquaculture systems ever created by human beings. The UNESCO citation noted that the system demonstrated exceptional testimony to the cultural traditions of the Gunditjmara people and their deep knowledge of the landscape, the seasons, and the behavior of the species they managed. But here is the part that should trouble you. The Budj Bim system was operating continuously for thousands of years. It was still functioning when the first Europeans arrived in the region in the early 19th century, and within a few decades of European settlement, it was almost completely destroyed. The channels were filled in to create grazing land for cattle. The weirs were dismantled, the wetlands were drained, the stone structures were pulled apart and used for fence posts and road foundations. A system that had sustained a civilization for more than 6 millennia was dismantled in less than 50 years, and the people who destroyed it did not even realize what they were destroying. Number 2. The stone houses of Lake Conda, permanent dwellings older than anything in Europe. Just a few kilometers from the Bujbim aquaculture channels, on the shores of what was once Lake Conda, there are the remains of stone houses, not temporary shelters, not lean-tos made from branches, permanent stone-walled houses with defined rooms, doorways oriented to face away from the prevailing wind, and foundations that have survived for thousands of years. The houses were built from the same volcanic basalt that the Gunditjmara used for their aquaculture channels. The walls were constructed using a dry stone technique, meaning no mortar was used. The stones were carefully selected for size and shape, then fitted together with enough precision that the walls have remained standing for centuries, even after being abandoned and exposed to the elements. Archaeological surveys of the Lake Conda area have identified the remains of more than 150 stone structures. Some are small single-room dwellings that could have housed a family of 4 or 5. Others are larger, multi-room structures that may have served communal purposes, gathering spaces where extended family groups came together for ceremonies, decision-making, or the processing and distribution of the eel harvest from the nearby aquaculture system. The houses were not scattered randomly across the landscape. They were clustered in groups, forming what can only be described as villages. Some of these village clusters contain 20 or 30 structures arranged along the shores of the lake or beside the aquaculture channels, with clear pathways between them. The spatial organization suggests planning, a deliberate arrangement of living spaces in relation to water sources, food production areas, and communal gathering points. Inside the houses, archaeologists have found the remains of hearths, grinding stones for processing grain and plant foods, and stone tools for working wood and animal hides. They have found the bones of eels, fish, possums, kangaroos, and water birds, the dietary evidence of a people who were eating well and eating consistently. They have found the charred remains of plant foods, tubers, and roots and seeds, suggesting that the Gunditjmara were not just fishing and hunting, but also cultivating and harvesting plant resources in a systematic way. The dating of these structures has been a matter of ongoing research, but the current evidence suggests that permanent stone dwellings have existed in this region for at least several thousand years. Some researchers believe the tradition of stonehouse construction in this area may extend back much further, potentially to the period immediately following the volcanic eruption that created the basalt landscape, which would place the origins of these structures at close to 30,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, 30,000 years ago, most of Europe was under ice. The Lascaux cave paintings in France, often cited as among the earliest evidence of human artistic expression in Europe, date to roughly 17,000 years ago. The oldest known permanent structures in Europe, the stone temples of Malta, date to around 5,500 years ago. If the earliest estimates for the Lake Conda stone houses are correct, the Gunditjmara were building permanent dwellings more than 20,000 years before anyone in Europe managed the same feat. But even the more conservative dating estimates are remarkable. 6,000 years of continuous occupation in permanent stone houses, supported by a sophisticated aquaculture economy, connected to long-distance trade networks and managed through cultural practices and ecological knowledge passed down through hundreds of generations. This was not a temporary camp, this was a civilization. And yet, for more than 200 years, the official history of Australia maintained that Aboriginal people were purely nomadic, that they had no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no engineering, no economy beyond the most basic subsistence. The stone houses of Lake Condah were known to local pastoralists who had been grazing cattle on the land for generations. They had seen the walls, they had walked past them, some of them had pulled the stones apart to build their own fences, but none of them recognized what they were looking at, or perhaps they simply did not want to. Number 3, Byamese Ngunhu at Brewarina, the oldest human-made structure on Earth. In the far northwest of New South Wales, on the banks of the Barwon River, there is a structure that may be the oldest human-made construction still in existence anywhere on the planet. It is called Byamese Ngunhu, though it is more commonly known as the Brewarina fish traps, and calling them fish traps does not begin to do justice to what they actually are. The structure consists of a series of stone weirs and pens built across the riverbed, creating an interconnected network of pools and channels that direct fish into holding pens where they can be easily harvested. The design is elegant in its simplicity, but remarkable in its scale and sophistication. The weirs are constructed from river stones, carefully placed to withstand the force of seasonal flooding, while still allowing water to flow through at controlled rates. The holding pens are designed to trap fish of specific sizes, allowing smaller fish to escape and continue growing while retaining larger fish for harvest. The system stretches for nearly 500 meters along the riverbed, 500 meters of carefully engineered stone structures, built and maintained over thousands of years by the Ngemba people and other Aboriginal groups who shared custodianship of the site. At its peak, the system was capable of trapping thousands of fish in a single season, providing enough food to support large gatherings of people from across the region. And those gatherings were not small. Historical accounts from the early colonial period describe assemblies of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of Aboriginal people gathering at Brewarina for intertribal meetings, trade, ceremony, and the collective harvesting and distribution of the fish catch. These were not informal get-togethers. They were organized events with protocols for behavior, established trading relationships, ceremonial obligations, and systems for the equitable distribution of resources. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, political and economic summits. The dating of the Brewarina fish traps is contested, as is often the case with Aboriginal sites, but estimates range from several thousand years to potentially 40,000 years old. If the upper estimates are correct, this structure predates the cave paintings at Lascaux, the megalithic temples of Göbekli Tepe, and every other known human-made construction by tens of thousands of years. The Nemba oral histories describe the fish traps as being created by the ancestral being Bayame, who laid down the stones during the dreaming, the period of creation that forms the foundation of Aboriginal spiritual and cultural life. These stories are not simply myths or legends in the Western sense. They are encoded knowledge, carrying within them information about the design, construction, maintenance, and governance of the fish trap system. Different sections of the traps were assigned to different family groups, and the rights and responsibilities associated with each section were embedded in the dreaming stories. ensuring that the system was maintained and the catch was distributed fairly across generations. When Europeans first encountered the Brewerina fish traps in the 19th century, they were astonished by their scale and complexity. Some early observers compared them favorably to Roman aqueducts, but that initial admiration quickly gave way to neglect and destruction. The river was dammed upstream, altering the flow patterns that the fish traps depended on. Cattle were driven across the structures, dislodging stones and damaging the weirs. Floods, their severity increased by upstream land clearing, washed away sections that had stood for millennia. By the mid-20th century, much of the original structure had been damaged or destroyed. Conservation efforts have since attempted to restore parts of the system, but the damage done in less than 2 centuries of European presence had undone thousands of years of careful construction and maintenance. Number 4. Wadi Yuwang, the stone circle that tracked the stars. About 75 kilometers west of Melbourne, in a paddock that most people drive past without a second glance, there is a stone arrangement that has been quietly challenging everything we think we know about the history of astronomy. It is called Wadi Yuwang, and it is an egg-shaped ring of basalt stones, roughly 50 meters across at its widest point, set into the earth on a gentle rise overlooking a broad valley. The stones are not large. Most of them are no taller than waist height. They are not dramatically positioned on a hilltop or arranged in towering columns like Stonehenge. They sit quietly in the grass, modest and unassuming, easy to dismiss as a random scattering of volcanic rock. But they are not random, not even close. The arrangement was created by the Wathaurong people, the traditional custodians of this region, and research conducted over the past 2 decades suggests that it functions as a sophisticated astronomical observatory. The stones mark the positions of the setting sun at the equinoxes and solstices with a degree of accuracy that has surprised even the researchers studying it. The egg-shaped outline of the arrangement is oriented along a rough east-west axis. At the western end, a prominent trio of stones marks the position where the sun sets on the equinoxes, the 2 days each year when day and night are of equal length. Other stones along the western arc mark the positions of the setting sun at the summer and winter solstices, the longest and shortest days of the year. The alignment is not approximate, it is precise enough that modern researchers using GPS equipment have confirmed the correlations. What this means is significant. To create an arrangement like Wadi Yuwang, the builders needed to observe the sun's movement across the sky over at least a full year, probably many years, to identify the exact positions of the solstice and equinox sunsets on the local horizon. They then needed to translate those observations into physical markers on the ground, selecting and placing stones with enough accuracy that the alignments would remain valid over time. This requires not just astronomical knowledge, but also mathematical reasoning, spatial planning, and an understanding of the relationship between celestial events and terrestrial geometry. The dating of Wadi Yuwang is uncertain. The stones themselves cannot be dated using standard techniques, because basalt does not contain the organic material needed for radiocarbon dating, and the arrangement has been disturbed over the centuries by farming activity. But the Wathaurong oral traditions associated with the site suggest great antiquity, and the level of astronomical knowledge embedded in the design is consistent with observations accumulated over many generations. Some researchers have drawn comparisons between Wadi Yuwang and Stonehenge, both in terms of their astronomical function and their cultural significance. Stonehenge dates to roughly 5,000 years ago. If Wurdi Yuwang is of comparable or greater age, it would represent one of the earliest known examples of astronomical observation encoded in a permanent physical structure anywhere in the world. But the comparison also highlights the disparity in how these sites have been treated by the wider world. Stonehenge is one of the most famous archaeological sites on the planet, visited by millions of people every year, protected by law, studied by hundreds of researchers, and recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Wurdi Yuwang sits in a paddock behind a wire fence, largely unknown even to most Australians. It has received a fraction of the research attention and almost none of the public recognition that a site of its potential significance deserves. And Wurdi Yuwang is not unique. There are hundreds of stone arrangements across Australia, many of them unstudied, many of them on private land, many of them damaged or destroyed by farming, development, or simple neglect. Each of them potentially contains encoded knowledge about astronomy, ecology, geography, and cultural practice that we may never fully recover. Number 5. The Tolondo Channel, an engineered waterway that modern surveyors could not improve. Not far from the Budge Bim system, in the Western District of Victoria, there is a channel that cuts through the landscape for more than 2 kilometers. It is called the Tolondo Channel, and when it was first surveyed by European engineers in the 19th century, they assumed it was a natural watercourse. It was only later, after more careful examination, that they realized it had been dug by hand. The channel connects 2 natural wetland systems, directing water from one to the other in a controlled flow that maintained water levels in both systems regardless of seasonal variation. It was, in modern terms, an irrigation channel, a piece of water infrastructure designed to manage a landscape-scale resource. What surprised the surveyors was the precision of the channel's gradient. It fell at a rate that maintained a steady flow of water without causing erosion of the channel banks or silting of the channel bed. When modern surveyors measured the gradient using laser equipment, they found that it was within 1% of the optimal grade for a channel of its dimensions. The builders had achieved using nothing more than stone tools and an intimate knowledge of the landscape, a result that would satisfy a modern engineering specification. The Tolondo Channel was not built in isolation. It was part of the same broader water management system that included the Budge Bim Aquaculture Network and the Lake Conda Settlement Complex. Together, these elements formed an integrated infrastructure that controlled water flow across an area of hundreds of square kilometers, supporting permanent settlements, sustaining aquaculture operations, and maintaining the ecological health of the wetlands that underpinned the entire economy. The people who built and maintained this system did not have metal tools. They did not have surveying instruments. They did not have written engineering manuals or formal mathematical notation. What they had was knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years of observation, experimentation, and practice, encoded in oral traditions and cultural practices, and passed down through generations with the fidelity that ensured the system continued to function for millennia. When European pastoralists arrived in the region in the 1840s, they found a landscape that had been shaped by human hands for longer than any European civilization had existed. They did not recognize it as such. They saw flat grassland and wetlands, assumed it was natural, and set about draining the wetlands, filling in the channels, pulling apart the stone walls, and converting the land to cattle grazing. Within a generation, 6,000 years of landscape engineering was dismantled, and the people who had built it were displaced, dispossessed, and subjected to policies designed to erase their culture and their connection to the land they had managed for longer than anyone can accurately measure. Number 6, the yam daisy fields. Agriculture that did not look like agriculture. One of the most persistent myths about Aboriginal Australia is that its people did not practice agriculture. This myth is rooted in a very specific, very European definition of what agriculture looks like. If agriculture means ploughing fields, planting annual crops in rows, and harvesting them with mechanical equipment, then no, Aboriginal people did not practice agriculture. But if agriculture means the deliberate cultivation, management, and harvesting of plant resources on a landscape scale, then Aboriginal people across southeastern Australia were among the most sophisticated agriculturalists the world has ever seen. The evidence for this begins with a plant called the yam daisy, known by its scientific name Microceras lanceolata. It is a small, unpretentious plant with a yellow flower that looks something like a dandelion. Its root is a tuber, roughly the size and shape of a small sweet potato, starchy and nutritious, with a flavor that early European observers compared to coconut or sweet potato. Before European settlement, the yam daisy grew in vast quantities across the volcanic plains of Victoria and into parts of South Australia and New South Wales. The explorer Thomas Mitchell, travelling through the Western District of Victoria in 1836, described fields of yam daisies stretching to the horizon. He noted that the ground had been systematically dug and turned, creating a landscape that looked, to his European eyes, like ploughed farmland, because that is effectively what it was. The Aboriginal women of the region harvested yam daisy tubers using digging sticks, carefully removing the mature tubers while leaving smaller ones in the ground to continue growing. The digging process itself functioned as a form of tillage, aerating the soil and creating conditions that promoted the growth of new tubers. The women also replanted portions of the harvested tubers, ensuring the next season's crop. They used fire to clear competing vegetation and to recycle nutrients into the soil, creating and maintaining the open grasslands where yam daisies thrived. This was not foraging, this was not gathering, this was cultivation, a deliberate, systematic, multi-generational management of a food resource on a scale that could feed permanent populations of hundreds or thousands of people. The yam daisy fields of the Western District were, in every meaningful sense, farms. They simply did not look like European farms because the technology, the methodology, and the underlying philosophy of land management were entirely different. The yam daisy economy supported dense populations across southeastern Australia. Some researchers have estimated that the population density in parts of the Western District before European contact was comparable to that of agricultural societies in other parts of the world. These were not scattered bands of wandering hunter-gatherers. They were settled communities with reliable food production, surplus storage, long-distance trade, and complex social organization. And the yam daisy was only one element of a much larger agricultural system. Aboriginal people across Australia managed hundreds of plant species for food, medicine, fiber, and ceremony. They harvested native grains, grinding them into flour using stone mills, baking bread from the resulting dough. They managed orchards of fruit-bearing trees and shrubs, pruning, burning, and irrigating to maximize yields. They cultivated wetland plants for their tubers and seeds, managing water levels to optimize growing conditions. The earliest European explorers in southeastern Australia frequently described landscapes that looked managed, park-like, with widely spaced trees, clean understory, and expansive grasslands. They assumed this was the natural state of the landscape. It was not. It was the product of thousands of years of deliberate land management, a continent-scale garden maintained by fire, water management, selective harvesting, and replanting. When the pastoralists brought their sheep and cattle, the animals ate the yam daisies. The hard hooves compacted the soil, destroying the aerated, cultivated texture that millennia of digging stick agriculture had created. Within a few decades of European settlement, the yam daisy went from being one of the most abundant plants on the volcanic plains to being functionally extinct across most of its former range. A staple food that had sustained civilizations for thousands of years was wiped out by sheep. Number 7. The grinding stones of Cuddy Springs, bread baking 30,000 years ago. In central New South Wales, at a site called Cuddy Springs, archaeologists have found grinding stones that were used to process seeds into flour more than 30,000 years ago. 30,000 years ago. That date is not a typo. It is more than 20,000 years before the earliest known evidence of grain processing anywhere else in the world. The stones are large, flat slabs of sandstone with smooth, concave surfaces created by thousands of hours of grinding. Microscopic analysis of the grinding surfaces has revealed starch residues from a variety of native grasses and seeds, including species that are still used as food sources by Aboriginal communities today. The residues confirm that these stones were used for exactly what they appear to have been used for: the grinding of seeds into flour for the production of bread or similar starchy foods. The implications of this finding are extraordinary. The conventional narrative of human history holds that grain processing and bread making began in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, roughly 12 to 14,000 years ago, as part of the Neolithic revolution that gave rise to agriculture, settled communities, and eventually cities and civilizations. The Cuddy Springs grinding stones push that timeline back by at least 16,000 years, and they place the innovation not in the Middle East but in Australia. This does not mean that Aboriginal Australians invented agriculture in the way that the term is conventionally understood. The Neolithic revolution in the Middle East involved the domestication of specific grain species, the development of large-scale monoculture farming, and the establishment of permanent settlements organized around grain production and storage. Aboriginal grain processing in Australia took a different form, one that was integrated into a broader, more diversified food production system, rather than being the sole foundation of the economy. But the technological innovation, the idea that seeds could be ground into flour and turned into a storable, portable food product, appears to have originated in Australia far earlier than anywhere else. This is not a marginal or contested claim. The evidence from Cuddy Springs has been published in peer-reviewed archaeological journals and has been confirmed by multiple independent analyses. It is simply not widely known outside the specialist archaeological community because it does not fit the conventional narrative. And Cuddy Springs is not the only site. Grinding stones of great antiquity have been found at numerous locations across Australia, from the arid interior to the coastal margins. Many of them show evidence of prolonged intensive use, suggesting that grain processing was not an occasional activity, but a regular, significant component of Aboriginal food production across large areas of the continent. The women who did this grinding, and it was predominantly women's work, were not simply crushing seeds. They were selecting specific grain species for their nutritional properties, harvesting them at the optimal time, processing them using techniques refined over thousands of years, and producing food products that could be stored, traded, and transported over long distances. They were, by any reasonable definition, agriculturalists, practitioners of a food production system that was ancient when the pyramids were new. Number 8, the Great Stone Arrangements of Victoria, maps written in rock, across the volcanic plains of western and central Victoria, scattered through farmland and bushland. There are hundreds of stone arrangements that most Australians have never heard of. Some are circles, some are lines, some are complex geometric shapes, crescents and ovals, and parallel rows of carefully placed basalt boulders. Some are small enough to fit in a suburban backyard. Others stretch across hundreds of meters of landscape. These arrangements are not natural. They are not the result of geological processes or random accumulation. They are deliberate constructions placed by Aboriginal people over thousands of years for purposes that are still not fully understood by non-Aboriginal researchers. Some of the arrangements appear to have ceremonial significance, marking sites associated with dreaming stories and ancestral events. Some appear to have practical functions, marking territorial boundaries, seasonal camping sites, or the locations of water sources and food resources. Some, like Wurdi appear to encode astronomical knowledge, and some may serve multiple purposes simultaneously, functioning as maps, calendars, ceremonial spaces, and mnemonic devices all at once. The idea that stone arrangements could function as maps is not as strange as it might initially sound. Aboriginal people did not use written maps in the European sense, two-dimensional representations of geography drawn on paper or parchment, but they did create spatial representations of geographic and cultural knowledge, using the landscape itself as the medium. Stone arrangements could mark the positions of water sources relative to each other, indicate the direction and distance of travel between important sites, or represent the relationship between geographic features and the dreaming stories associated with them. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Victorian stone arrangements is the possibility that some of them form networks, interconnected systems of markers that, when read together, provide information about travel routes, resource locations, and seasonal patterns across large areas. If this is the case, then the stone arrangements represent something like a distributed library, a knowledge system encoded in the physical landscape, accessible to anyone with the cultural training to read it. Unfortunately, many of the stone arrangements have been damaged or destroyed since European settlement. Farmers have cleared them from paddocks. Road builders have used the stones for construction material. Urban development has paved over sites that once held encoded knowledge accumulated over millennia. And because the cultural knowledge needed to interpret the arrangements was deliberately suppressed during the colonial period, much of the information they contained may have been lost permanently. Some traditional knowledge holders still retain understanding of specific arrangements and their meanings, but the systematic interconnected network of stone-encoded knowledge that once covered large areas of the landscape has been fragmented, and the task of recovery is made more difficult with every generation that passes. Number 9. The permanent villages of the Western District, a population density that surprised everyone. When the first European pastoralists moved into the Western District of Victoria in the late 1830s and 1840s, they found something that did not match their expectations. They expected to find small scattered bands of nomadic people. Instead, they found large, organized communities living in permanent settlements. George Augustus Robinson, the chief protector of Aborigines in the Port Phillip district, traveled through the Western District in 1841 and recorded his observations in detailed journals. His accounts describe villages of substantial stone and timber houses, some containing 30 or 40 dwellings, arranged in organized clusters along waterways and around the edges of the volcanic lakes and wetlands. He described well-worn paths connecting these villages, suggesting regular travel and communication between settlements. He noted that the people appeared well-fed, well-organized, and in robust health. Robinson was not the only observer. Other early colonists recorded similar impressions. They described populations that seemed larger and more concentrated than they had anticipated, communities that appeared to have been living in the same locations for extended periods, and infrastructure, the stone houses, the aquaculture channels, the managed waterways, that spoke of long-term settlement rather than transient occupation. Some estimates suggest that the population of the Western District before European contact may have been as high as 10,000 people, living in a network of permanent and semi-permanent villages, connected by established trade routes and governed by complex systems of kinship, law, and ceremony. This population density was comparable to that of many agricultural societies around the world and was supported by the same combination of aquaculture, agriculture, and managed resource production that characterized the Buj Bim and Lake Condah complexes. Within 2 decades of European settlement, this population was reduced by more than 90%. Disease, displacement, violence, and the destruction of the food production systems that had sustained the community for thousands of years combined to create a demographic catastrophe of staggering proportions. The villages were abandoned, the stone houses fell into disrepair, the aquaculture channels silted up and were overgrown, and the people who survived were forced onto mission stations where their language, their cultural practices, and their connection to the land were systematically suppressed. The Western District villages are not unique. Similar permanent or semi-permanent settlements have been documented in other parts of Australia along the Murray River system, in the wetlands of the Top End, in the Lake Country of Western New South Wales, and in the rich coastal areas of the southeast. The pattern is consistent wherever the landscape provided sufficient resources to support permanent occupation. Aboriginal people built permanent communities with all the characteristics of settled, organized societies. The myth of universal nomadism was never based on evidence. It was based on assumption, the assumption that people without European-style buildings, European-style agriculture, and European-style written records could not possibly have created anything worth recognizing as a civilization. That assumption was wrong. Number 10. The Brew Arena intergroup gatherings, politics on a continental scale. The fish traps at Brew Arena were not just a food production system, they were a political institution. The annual gatherings at Brew Arena brought together Aboriginal groups from across a vast area of Western New South Wales and beyond, and these gatherings were occasions for far more than fishing. At Brew Arena, people from different language groups, different kinship systems, and different territorial areas came together to negotiate alliances, resolve disputes, arrange marriages, exchange knowledge, conduct ceremonies, and trade goods. The gatherings could last for weeks and could involve hundreds or thousands of participants. The governance of these gatherings was not informal. There were established protocols for who could fish in which section of the traps, who had the right to speak in discussions, how disputes were to be resolved, and how the catch was to be distributed. These protocols were embedded in the dreaming stories associated with the site, making them simultaneously legal, spiritual, and practical in nature. The trade that took place at Brew Arena connected the interior of the continent to the coast and linked communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of often difficult terrain. Goods traded at Brew Arena included stone tools from quarries in distant regions, ochre for ceremonial purposes, shells from the coast, fibers and textiles, preserved foods, medicinal plants, and songs, stories, and ceremonial knowledge. This last category, the exchange of intangible cultural property, is often overlooked but is arguably the most significant. The trading networks that converged at Brew Arena were not just economic systems. They were communication networks, channels through which information flowed across the continent. News, knowledge, innovation, and cultural practice moved along these networks, connecting communities that might otherwise have been isolated and enabling the kind of large-scale cultural coordination that characterized Aboriginal Australia before European contact. The idea that Aboriginal Australia lacked political organisation is another myth that does not survive contact with the evidence. The Brew Arena gatherings demonstrate a level of intergroup coordination that is comparable to the diplomatic systems of any pre-industrial society. The fact that this coordination was achieved without centralized political authority, without rioting, without standing armies, and without permanent bureaucracies makes it more remarkable, not less. Number 11. The Mount William Greenstone Quarry, an industrial operation that supplied a continent. In the hills northeast of Melbourne, near the town of Lancefield, there is a quarry site that was one of the most important industrial operations in pre-contact Australia. It is called the Mount William Greenstone Quarry, and for thousands of years, it was the primary source of a specific type of stone used to make axes across a vast area of southeastern Australia. The stone is a type of metamorphic rock called greenstone, dense, fine-grained, and exceptionally hard. Perfect for the production of ground-edge axes, one of the most important tools in the Aboriginal toolkit. Ground-edge axes were used for felling trees, stripping bark, cutting wood, and a range of other tasks. The quality of the stone determined the quality of the axe, and the greenstone from Mount William was recognized as among the finest available anywhere on the continent. The quarry itself is an impressive sight. The hillside is pitted with hundreds of extraction pits, shallow depressions where stone was dug from the earth using fire-hardening techniques and heavy stone hammers. The pits extend across an area of several hectares, and the amount of stone removed over the centuries of operation runs to thousands of tons. But the quarry was not simply a mine, it was a managed resource, controlled by the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the area. Access to the quarry was regulated by strict social and ceremonial protocols. Not everyone could quarry stone at Mount William. Permission had to be obtained from the quarry custodians, and that permission was typically granted in the context of trade relationships and ceremonial obligations. The stone from Mount William was traded across enormous distances. Axes made from Mount William greenstone have been found at sites hundreds of kilometers away, in all directions. The trade networks that distributed this stone connected dozens of language groups and crossed multiple ecological zones, from the coastal forests of the south to the arid plains of the north, from the mountain forests of the east to the volcanic plains of the west. The distribution pattern of Mount William greenstone has been mapped by archaeologists, and it reveals a trade network of extraordinary extent and complexity. The stone moved along established routes, passed from group to group in a series of reciprocal exchanges, each exchange reinforcing the social and political relationships that bound the network together. The quarry was not just an economic asset. It was a node in a continental scale social network, a place where relationships were made, maintained, and renewed through the exchange of a valued material. The quarry custodians occupied a position of considerable prestige and influence within this network. Their control over access to the stone gave them leverage in trade negotiations and political discussions, and the ceremonial obligations associated with the quarry reinforced their social standing. They were, in a very real sense, the owners of a natural resource that was essential to the functioning of the broader economy, and they managed that resource with a sophistication that ensured its sustainability over thousands of years. Number 12. Firestick farming, the technology that shaped a continent. Of all the technologies developed by Aboriginal Australians, firestick farming is perhaps the most significant and the least understood. It is also the technology that most dramatically illustrates the gap between what Aboriginal people actually did and what European observers thought they were seeing. Firestick farming is the practice of using controlled, deliberate burning to manage the landscape. Aboriginal people across Australia used fire to shape vegetation patterns, promote the growth of food plants, attract game animals, clear travel routes, reduce the risk of uncontrolled wildfire, and maintain the ecological health of the environments they lived in. The practice was not haphazard. It was based on an intimate knowledge of fire behavior, weather patterns, seasonal cycles, and the ecological requirements of hundreds of plant and animal species. Different areas were burned at different times of year, in different patterns and at different intensities, depending on the specific management objectives for that particular piece of country. Some areas were burned frequently to maintain open grassland. Some were burned infrequently to allow forest to regenerate. Some were never burned at all, maintained as refuges for fire-sensitive species. The cumulative effect of thousands of years of firestick farming was to create the landscape that Europeans encountered when they arrived in Australia. The open park-like woodlands that so delighted early colonial observers, the vast grasslands that supported their sheep and cattle, the mosaic of forest and clearings that gave the landscape its characteristic appearance. All of these were the product of Aboriginal fire management. The European colonists were not settling an empty wilderness. They were moving into a garden, a landscape that had been carefully designed and maintained by its human inhabitants over millennia. When Aboriginal people were removed from the land and their fire management practices ceased, the landscape began to change. Forests thickened, undergrowth accumulated, grasslands were invaded by shrubs, and the fuel loads in the bush built up to levels that had not been seen in thousands of years, creating the conditions for the catastrophic wildfires that have become an increasingly common feature of the Australian landscape. The Black Saturday bushfires of 2009, which killed 173 people and destroyed more than 2,000 homes in Victoria, burned through forests that had not been managed with traditional fire for more than a century. The fuel loads in those forests were far higher than they would have been under Aboriginal management, and the resulting fires were far more intense and far more destructive than the controlled burns that had maintained those landscapes for thousands of years before European arrival. The connection between the cessation of Aboriginal fire management and the increasing severity of Australian bushfires is now widely recognised by fire scientists and land managers. Some areas have begun to reintroduce traditional burning practices, working with Aboriginal knowledge holders to develop fire management strategies that draw on thousands of years of accumulated expertise. But the process of recovery is slow, and the knowledge that was lost during the colonial period cannot be easily replaced. Fire stick farming was not just a land management technique, it was the foundation of an entire way of life. The mosaic landscape it created supported a greater diversity of plant and animal species than any alternative management regime, providing Aboriginal people with a wider range of food, medicine, fiber, and material resources. It maintained the ecological processes, nutrient cycling, water infiltration, seed germination that kept the landscape productive, and it reduced the risk of catastrophic fire, protecting both the people and the land they depended on. To describe this as simply burning the bush is like describing modern agriculture as simply digging in the dirt. It was a sophisticated, knowledge-intensive, and deeply effective technology that shaped an entire continent over tens of thousands of years. And when it stopped, the consequences were devastating, not just for Aboriginal people, but for the landscape itself. Number 13, the Murray-Darling River Corridor, a highway of stone, fish, and ceremony. The Murray River and its major tributary, the Darling, together form the longest river system in Australia, draining an area of more than 1 million square kilometres across 4 states. For Aboriginal people, the Murray-Darling system was not just a source of water. It was the backbone of a continental-scale network of settlements, trade routes, and ceremonial connections that linked communities from the mountains of the southeast to the arid interior of the west. Along the banks of the Murray and its tributaries, there are thousands of Aboriginal sites, shell middens, earth mounds, stone arrangements, scarred trees, burial grounds, and camping sites that document continuous human occupation stretching back tens of thousands of years. In some areas, the density of archaeological sites along the river is among the highest anywhere in Australia, reflecting the fact that the river corridor supported some of the largest and most concentrated Aboriginal populations on the continent. The shell middens are particularly revealing. These are accumulations of freshwater mussel shells, sometimes mixed with the bones of fish, birds, and mammals, that represent the waste from thousands of years of meals. Some of the Murray River middens are enormous, stretching for hundreds of meters along the riverbank and standing several meters high. They contain literally tons of shell, representing millions of individual meals consumed over thousands of years of continuous occupation. The middens are not just evidence of eating, they are evidence of settled permanent or semi-permanent living. People do not accumulate middens of this size by passing through an area occasionally. They accumulate them by living in the same place, eating the same foods year after year, generation after generation, for thousands of years. The Murray River middens are evidence of permanent settlements, supported by the rich aquatic resources of the river and the productive floodplain landscape that surrounded it. The river was also a highway. Aboriginal people traveled along the Murray and its tributaries in bark canoes, some of which were large enough to carry several people and significant quantities of trade goods. The river connected communities that were separated by hundreds of kilometers of overland distance, enabling trade, communication, and ceremonial exchange on a scale that would have been impossible without a navigable waterway. Trade goods moved along the river in both directions. Greenstone axes from Mount William traveled north and west along the Murray. Pitori, a stimulant plant from the arid interior, traveled south and east. Red ochre from specific quarry sites was traded in all directions. Shells from the coast moved inland, possum skin cloaks, woven bags, and worked tools of various kinds all moved along the river corridor, connecting the diverse economies of the Murray-Darling Basin into an integrated trading system. The gatherings that took place along the Murray were similar in character to those at Brew Arena, large intergroup assemblies involving ceremony, trade, marriage negotiation, and dispute resolution. Some of the most significant of these gatherings took place at locations where the river divided into multiple channels or where major tributaries joined the mainstream, creating natural meeting points where different territorial groups could come together on neutral ground. The scale of Aboriginal occupation along the Murray-Darling system was so significant that it should have been impossible to ignore, and in many cases, the earliest European explorers did not ignore it. They recorded it. They described the large populations they encountered. They noted the villages, the fish traps, the middens, the canoes, the evidence of permanent settlement and organized society. But within a few decades, the populations they had described were devastated by disease, displacement, and violence, and the evidence of their civilization was buried under sheep stations, wheat fields, and the self-serving myth of an empty continent. Number 14, the earth mounds of the Western Plains, artificial hills for permanent living. Across the flat, flood-prone plains of Western Victoria and into parts of South Australia and New South Wales, there are thousands of raised earth mounds that have puzzled European observers since the early days of colonization. Some farmers thought they were natural geological features. Some assumed they were termite mounds. Some figured they were just random lumps of dirt. They were none of these things. The mounds are artificial. They were built by Aboriginal people over hundreds or thousands of years, gradually accumulating through the repeated use of the same living site. The mounds are composed of layers of ash, charcoal, clay, shell, bone, and organic material, each layer representing a period of occupation, a season spent living, cooking, eating, and sleeping on the same raised platform above the flood-prone plain. The mounds served a critical practical function. The western plains of Victoria are flat and low-lying, and during the wet season, large areas flood. The mounds provided elevated dry living platforms that allowed communities to remain in the area year-round, rather than being forced to retreat to higher ground during floods. By building up their living sites above the flood level, Aboriginal people effectively created permanent settlement sites in a landscape that would otherwise have been habitable only seasonally. Some of the mounds are substantial. The largest documented mounds stand several meters above the surrounding plain and extend over areas of 100 square meters or more. They represent centuries of accumulated occupation debris. each generation adding to the height and extent of the platform that previous generations had built. In some cases, multiple mounds are clustered together, forming what amounts to a raised village, a collection of elevated living platforms connected by paths and surrounded by the wetlands and grasslands that provided food and materials. Archaeological excavation of the mounds has revealed a rich record of Aboriginal life on the Western Plains. The ash layers contain the remains of hearths, evidence of cooking fires maintained over long periods. The bone fragments include the remains of eels, fish, birds, possums, and kangaroos. The shell fragments come from freshwater mussels harvested from nearby waterways. Stone tools grinding stones and worked bone are found throughout the deposits, documenting a technologically capable society with diverse subsistence strategies. The mounds also contain evidence of the ceremonies, social gatherings, and cultural practices that accompanied daily life. Ochre, used for body painting and ceremonial purposes, is found in many of the deposits. Ornamental objects, including pierced shells and worked teeth, suggest personal adornment and social signaling. The spatial arrangement of materials within the mounds, with cooking areas, sleeping areas, and refuse areas clearly differentiated, indicates organized domestic life, not transient camping. The distribution of the mounds across the landscape follows patterns that are not random. Mounds tend to be located on the margins of wetlands, near the confluences of waterways, or along the edges of the volcanic stone country where the basalt aquaculture channels begin. This positioning reflects a strategic logic. The mounds were built where access to water, food, and building materials was optimal, creating a network of permanent settlement sites integrated with the broader landscape management system. Estimates of the number of earth mounds in Western Victoria alone run into the thousands. Most have never been excavated. Many have been damaged or destroyed by farming activity, plowed flat and mixed into the topsoil of paddocks that now grow wheat and canola. Each one that is destroyed takes with it a record of human life and activity that may extend back thousands of years, an archive of occupation that is irreplaceable once lost. Number 15. The seed stores and grain harvests of inland Australia, a breadbasket nobody recognized. The interior of Australia is often imagined as a vast, barren waste, a place of endless red sand and spinifex where survival is a constant struggle against heat, drought, and scarcity. This image is not entirely wrong, but it is deeply misleading. The arid and semi-arid landscapes of inland Australia are ecologically complex environments that support a surprising diversity of plant and animal life. And Aboriginal people developed food production systems in these environments that were, by any reasonable measure, forms of agriculture. The most striking of these systems was the large-scale harvesting and processing of native grain. Across the arid interior, particularly in the Channel Country of Western Queensland and the Lake Country of Western New South Wales and South Australia, Aboriginal people harvested wild grains from native grasses in quantities that exceeded what was needed for immediate consumption. The surplus was processed, stored, and traded. The harvesting process was systematic and organized. When the grasses ripened, people gathered in large groups to cut and collect the seed heads. The seeds were then separated from the chaff using winnowing techniques, ground into flour using grinding stones, and either consumed immediately as bread or damper, or stored in skin bags and bark containers for later use. Some groups constructed dedicated storage structures, platforms raised above the ground to protect the grain from moisture and vermin, that functioned in the same way as the granaries of agricultural societies in other parts of the world. The explorer Charles Sturt, traveling through the Channel Country of Western Queensland in the 1840s, described encountering large haystacks of cut grass, clearly assembled by human hands, in areas where no Europeans had previously traveled. He noted that the haystacks were located near camping sites with grinding stones and other evidence of grain processing, and he concluded that the local people were systematically harvesting and storing grain on a scale that went far beyond casual gathering. Other explorers made similar observations. Ludwig Leichhardt described fields of cultivated grain along watercourses in northern Australia. Edward John Eyre noted the extensive use of native seeds as food sources by the people of the Murray-Darling Basin. Thomas Mitchell, as noted earlier, described landscapes that looked like ploughed farmland in the Western District of Victoria. These observations were recorded, published, and then largely ignored. They did not fit the narrative that European colonization required, the narrative of an empty continent, a terra nullius, inhabited only by primitive nomads who made no use of the land and had no claim to it. Acknowledging that Aboriginal people practiced agriculture, built permanent settlements, and managed the landscape on a continental scale would have undermined the legal and moral justification for dispossession. So the evidence was set aside and the myth persisted. The native grain species that Aboriginal people harvested are now attracting interest from modern agricultural researchers. Native millet, native rice, kangaroo grass, and other species that were staples of the Aboriginal grain economy are being investigated as potential crops for modern production, particularly in arid and semi-arid environments, where conventional agriculture is difficult or impossible. The irony is not subtle. The agricultural knowledge that was dismissed and destroyed during colonization may hold solutions to the agricultural challenges of the future. Number 16. The songlines. A navigation system encoded in music. Of all the intellectual achievements of Aboriginal Australia, the songlines may be the most extraordinary and the most difficult for non-Aboriginal people to fully comprehend. Songlines are navigational routes across the landscape, encoded in song, story, dance, and ceremony, that connect distant places and people across the entire continent. Each songline is a journey. The song describes the route in detail, naming landmarks, water sources, food resources, and significant cultural sites along the way. By singing the song, a traveler can navigate across country they have never physically visited, following the descriptions embedded in the lyrics to find their way from one place to the next. The songs function as maps, but they are far more than maps. They also encode ecological knowledge, telling the traveler what foods are available at each location and in which season. They encode social information, identifying which groups have custodianship of which areas and what protocols must be observed when crossing their country. And they encode spiritual information, connecting the physical landscape to the dreaming stories that give it meaning. The songlines do not operate in isolation. They are part of an interconnected network that spans the entire continent. A songline that begins in the desert of Central Australia may pass through the tropical forests of the north and end on the coast of the south, connecting communities separated by thousands of kilometers through a shared narrative. Different sections of the songline are maintained by different groups, each responsible for the portion that passes through their country. The sections must be performed in the correct sequence and in the correct manner for the songline to function as an integrated navigational and cultural system. The coordination required to maintain this system across dozens of language groups and thousands of kilometers of diverse terrain is remarkable. It implies a level of intergroup communication, cultural standardization, and intellectual cooperation that is without parallel in any other pre-literate society. The songliners are, in effect, a continental library, a distributed knowledge system that stores and transmits information across time and space using the human voice as the storage medium and the landscape itself as the organizing framework. The navigational precision of the songlines has been confirmed by modern researchers who have followed them using GPS equipment. The routes described in the songs consistently correspond to actual paths across the landscape, following the most efficient lines of travel between water sources, avoiding dangerous terrain, and connecting significant cultural and ecological sites. The information encoded in the songs is not vague or approximate. It is specific, detailed, and accurate, the product of thousands of years of accumulated observation and refinement. The songlines also functioned as trade routes. The same paths that carried songs and stories across the continent also carried goods, connecting the economies of distant regions and enabling the exchange of materials, technologies, and cultural practices. The overlap between navigational, cultural, and economic functions is characteristic of Aboriginal knowledge systems, which tend to integrate information across domains rather than separating it into the specialized categories that Western knowledge systems prefer. The colonization of Australia disrupted the songlines in ways that are still being felt. When Aboriginal people were removed from their country and concentrated on missions and reserves, the sections of songlines that passed through their territory could no longer be maintained. When languages were suppressed and cultural practices banned, the songs themselves began to be forgotten. When the landscape was altered by farming, mining, and development, the physical landmarks described in the songs were destroyed or obscured. The loss is incalculable. Each section of a songline that is forgotten represents the loss of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, navigational, ecological, social, and spiritual, that cannot be recovered from any other source. The songlines were a technology of extraordinary sophistication, a way of organizing and transmitting information that was perfectly adapted to the specific conditions of Aboriginal life. And they were destroyed not by any inherent weakness in the system, but by the deliberate suppression of the culture that created and maintained them. Number 17. The smallpox apocalypse, the plague that arrived before the settlers. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell and hardest to hear, because when Europeans talk about the disappearance of Aboriginal civilization, the unspoken assumption is usually that it was a gradual process, a slow decline caused by cultural contact, changing circumstances, and the inevitable march of progress. The reality is far more brutal and far more sudden. There is strong evidence that smallpox reached Aboriginal Australia before European settlement had extended much beyond the coastal areas. The first recorded smallpox epidemic among Aboriginal people occurred in 1789, just 1 year after the establishment of the penal colony at Sydney Cove. The epidemic swept through the Aboriginal population of the Sydney Basin with devastating effect, killing an estimated 50 to 90% of the local population within months. but the epidemic did not stay in Sydney. It spread, carried by Aboriginal people themselves along the trade routes and song lines that connected communities across the continent. Within a few years, smallpox had travelled far beyond the areas of European settlement, reaching communities in the interior that had never seen a European face. By the time European explorers and pastoralists pushed into the inland areas in the 1830s and 1840s, they were entering a landscape that had already been depopulated by disease. The evidence for this pre-contact demographic collapse is found in multiple sources. Early explorers repeatedly described encountering small, scattered groups of Aboriginal people in areas where the archaeological evidence indicated much larger populations in the recent past. They found abandoned settlements, unused fish traps, overgrown aquaculture channels, and empty villages. They found the remains of people who had died of disease, sometimes in large numbers, in areas where no European had previously travelled. The implications of this are profound. When the pastoralists arrived in the Western District of Victoria in the 1840s, they may not have encountered the full civilization that had existed there just a few decades earlier. The population had already been decimated by disease. The social structures that maintained the aquaculture systems, the stone houses, and the agricultural economy had already been disrupted. The landscape was already in transition, the fires unlit, the channels unmaintained, the yam daisy fields ungrazed. The Europeans did not arrive in a functioning civilization and dismantle it. In many areas, they arrived in the aftermath of an apocalypse and mistook the ruins for the normal state of affairs. They saw a diminished, traumatized population struggling to survive in a landscape that was already beginning to revert to its unmanaged state, and they assumed that this was how things had always been. They looked at the remnants and saw the whole. They looked at the aftermath of catastrophe and saw the natural condition. This misperception has shaped the historical narrative ever since. The myth of the nomadic, non-agricultural, non-civilized Aboriginal Australian was built in part on observations made during a period of demographic and cultural collapse. It was like arriving in Europe during the Black Death and concluding that Europeans had never built cities. Number 18. Terra nullius, the legal fiction that erased a civilization. The legal doctrine of terra nullius, literally nobody's land, was the foundation upon which the entire colonial enterprise in Australia was built. It held that Australia, at the time of British colonisation, was effectively unoccupied, that the Aboriginal people who lived there did not have systems of law, governance, or land ownership that Britain was obligated to recognise. This doctrine was not based on ignorance, it was based on choice. The early colonists knew that Aboriginal people occupied the land. They could see the stone structures, the fish traps, the managed landscapes, the permanent settlements. Many of them recorded detailed descriptions of what they saw. But acknowledging that Aboriginal people had established, organised societies with legitimate claims to the land would have created legal and political complications that the colonial project could not afford. So the evidence was dismissed. The stone houses were called primitive shelters. The aquaculture systems were called natural formations. The agricultural practices were called gathering. The permanent settlements were called temporary camps. The complex social and political systems were called savage customs. And the people themselves were classified as something less than fully human, a dying race that would inevitably fade away in the face of European civilization. Terra nullius was not officially overturned until 1992, when the Australian High Court handed down its decision into Mabo case, recognizing for the first time that Aboriginal people had a pre-existing system of law and land ownership that survived British colonization. The decision was a landmark, but it came more than 200 years after the fact, and by then the damage was done. The legal fiction of terra nullius had provided the justification for the dispossession of an entire continent. Under its cover, Aboriginal people were removed from their lands, separated from their families, forbidden from practicing their culture, and denied the most basic rights of citizenship. Their children were taken and placed in institutions designed to strip them of their identity. Their languages were banned, their ceremonies were outlawed, their knowledge systems were dismissed as superstition, and the physical evidence of their civilization was systematically destroyed. Stone structures were pulled apart for building materials. Aquaculture channels were filled in for farming. Fish traps were dynamited to make way for dams and weirs. Stone arrangements were cleared from paddocks. Earth mounds were plowed flat. Sacred sites were desecrated, built over, or simply ignored. The destruction was not accidental. It was a necessary consequence of the legal and ideological framework that justified colonization. If Aboriginal people had no civilization, then there was nothing to destroy. And if there was nothing to destroy, then nothing had been lost. The circular logic of terra nullius ensured that the evidence of its own falsity was erased as quickly as it was produced. Number 19. The mission stations, where knowledge went to die. After the initial wave of dispossession and disease, the surviving Aboriginal people of southeastern Australia were concentrated on mission stations, government reserves, and pastoral stations where they were expected to live under European supervision. The missions were operated by various Christian denominations and were designed with varying degrees of explicit intention to assimilate Aboriginal people into European culture by eliminating their own. On the missions, Aboriginal languages were forbidden. Children were punished for speaking their mother tongue. Cultural ceremonies were banned. Traditional food gathering practices were discouraged or prohibited. The knowledge systems that had sustained Aboriginal civilization for tens of thousands of years, the astronomical observations, the ecological management techniques, the engineering knowledge, the songlines, the ceremonial protocols, were treated as primitive superstitions to be replaced by Christian education and European work habits. The effects were devastating and deliberate. Within a generation or two, much of the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years was lost. Young people who grew up on the missions did not learn the songs, the stories, the techniques, and the practices that their grandparents had known. The chain of intergenerational knowledge transmission, which had been unbroken for 60,000 years, was severed. Some knowledge survived. Some elders managed to pass on songs, stories, and practices in secret, maintaining fragments of the old knowledge despite the active suppression of the mission authorities. Some communities managed to maintain their connection to country even while living on missions, returning to traditional lands when they could to perform ceremonies and maintain sacred sites. And some knowledge was preserved in the records of sympathetic observers, anthropologists, linguists, and others who recognized the value of what was being lost and worked to document it before it disappeared entirely. But the losses were enormous. Languages that had been spoken continuously for tens of thousands of years fell silent. Songlines that had navigated people across thousands of kilometers of country were forgotten. Ecological knowledge that had maintained the productivity of entire landscapes was lost. Engineering techniques that had built and maintained aquaculture systems, stone houses, and water channels were no longer practiced. Astronomical observations that had tracked the movements of the stars for millennia were no longer made. The missions did not just destroy knowledge, they destroyed the conditions that made knowledge possible. Aboriginal knowledge systems were not abstract collections of facts stored in books or databases. They were living systems embedded in relationships between people, places, stories, ceremonies, and practices. They required the active participation of communities living on their country, performing their ceremonies, speaking their languages, and practicing their skills. Remove the people from their country, silence their languages, and ban their ceremonies, and the knowledge system itself begins to collapse, like an ecosystem deprived of its keystone species. The recovery of this knowledge is now one of the most urgent cultural projects in Australia. Aboriginal communities across the country are working to revitalize their languages, restore their connections to country, and recover the knowledge that was nearly lost during the colonial period. But the task is immense and the resources available are inadequate. For every piece of knowledge that is recovered, countless others have been lost beyond recovery, buried with the elders who carried them and never passed on to the next generation. Number 20, the deliberate destruction of sites. Bulldozers, dynamite, and willful amnesia. The destruction of Aboriginal cultural sites in Australia did not end with the colonial period. It has continued in various forms throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Some of this destruction has been the result of ignorance, development, proceeding without any awareness that significant cultural sites were being impacted. But much of it has been deliberate, carried out with full knowledge of what was being destroyed, and with the active complicity of governments and regulatory authorities. The most notorious recent example is the destruction of the Juukan Gorge rock shelters in Western Australia in May 2020. The shelters, which contained evidence of human occupation dating back 46,000 years, were destroyed by the mining company Rio Tinto to expand an iron ore mine. The destruction proceeded despite the fact that the archaeological significance of the site was known, despite objections from the traditional owners, and despite the fact that the company had legal alternatives that would have allowed the mine to proceed without destroying the shelters. The Juukan Gorge destruction generated international outrage, congressional hearings, and the resignation of several senior Rio Tinto executives, but it was not an isolated incident. Across Australia, Aboriginal cultural sites are routinely damaged or destroyed by mining, farming, development, and infrastructure construction. The legal protections that exist on paper are often inadequate in practice, undermined by exemptions, loopholes, and a regulatory culture that tends to prioritize economic development over cultural heritage. The scale of the ongoing destruction is difficult to quantify because many sites have never been formally recorded or assessed. It is estimated that tens of thousands of Aboriginal cultural sites have been destroyed since European settlement, and the pace of destruction has accelerated in recent decades as mining and development have expanded into previously undisturbed areas. Each site that is destroyed represents an irreplaceable loss. The stone arrangements, the rock art, the shell middens, the earth mounds, the quarry sites, the fish traps, and the scarred trees are not just archaeological curiosities. They are the physical evidence of a civilization that existed on this continent for longer than any other known human society. They are the remains of the stone cities, the engineered waterways, the agricultural systems, and the cultural practices that sustained Aboriginal Australia for tens of thousands of years before European arrival. And once they are gone forever. You cannot rebuild a 46,000-year-old rock shelter. You cannot reassemble a 6,000-year-old aquaculture channel from the rubble used to build a cattle yard. You cannot recover the knowledge encoded in a stone arrangement after it has been cleared from a paddock and dumped in a pile at the edge of a field. The destruction of Aboriginal cultural heritage is not just a loss for Aboriginal people, it is a loss for all of humanity. The history that these sites contain is not local history. It is the history of human ingenuity, adaptability, and endurance on the oldest continuously inhabited continent on Earth. When a site is destroyed, a chapter of the human story is erased permanently and irreversibly. Number 21. The scarred trees, living records of a people who shaped wood. Scattered across southeastern Australia, in parks, in remnant bushland, in the middle of suburban neighbourhoods, and along the banks of rivers that have been flowing since long before human memory began, there are trees that carry scars. Not the scars of lightning or disease or the random damage of weather. These are symmetrical, deliberate, carefully shaped scars, the marks left by Aboriginal people who removed sections of bark from living trees for specific purposes, sometimes hundreds of years ago. The scar trees, as they are known, are among the most widespread and least appreciated evidence of Aboriginal material culture in southeastern Australia. They are also among the most vulnerable because the trees themselves are aging, and when they fall, the evidence they carry falls with them. Aboriginal people removed bark from trees for a wide range of purposes. Large sheets of bark were used to construct shelters, canoes, water containers, and shields. Smaller pieces were used for coolamans, the shallow wooden dishes used to carry food, water, babies, and gathered materials. The bark was also used for artistic and ceremonial purposes, as surfaces for painting, and as materials for the construction of ceremonial objects. The process of removing bark was not casual. It required skill and knowledge. The right species of tree had to be selected, typically eucalypts, box trees, or she oaks, depending on the intended use. The bark had to be removed at the right time of year when the sap was flowing, and the bark could be peeled cleanly without killing the tree. The incision had to be made at the right depth, cutting through the outer bark without damaging the cambium layer beneath, which was essential for the tree's continued growth and survival. The resulting scar is distinctive. It is typically oval or shield-shaped with clean, straight edges where the cutting tool, usually a stone axe or a shell scraper, was used to mark the outline before the bark was peeled away. Over time, the tree grows new bark around the edges of the scar, creating a raised border that frames the original wound. The scar itself remains visible for as long as the tree survives, which, in the case of some Australian eucalypts, can be hundreds of years. Some scar trees carry evidence of multiple bark removals, scars of different ages and sizes on the same trunk, indicating that the tree was used as a resource repeatedly over a long period. Some carry scars from the removal of very large bark sheets, suitable for canoe construction, which required considerable effort and a mature, straight-trunked tree of the right species. Some carry smaller scars from the removal of bark for shields or kulemons, everyday items that were produced regularly and in large quantities. The canoe trees are particularly impressive. A bark canoe required a single sheet of bark several meters long and a meter or more wide, peeled in one piece from a large, straight eucalypt. The resulting scar can be enormous, extending from near the base of the tree to well above head height. These scars are unmistakable, and some of them are on trees that are estimated to be 300 or 400 years old, meaning the canoes were made before European contact. The distribution of scar trees across the landscape provides information about Aboriginal land use patterns. Clusters of scar trees indicate areas of sustained occupation, places where people lived long enough and in sufficient numbers to use multiple trees for bark resources. The species of trees selected and the sizes and types of scars they carry provide information about the specific activities that took place in each area, whether people were building shelters, making canoes, preparing coolamans, or constructing ceremonial objects. Unfortunately, scar trees are disappearing at an alarming rate. Old growth trees are dying of natural causes, and when they fall, the evidence they carry is lost. Development has removed countless scar trees from urban and suburban areas. Farmers have cleared them from paddocks. Road construction has cut through stands of trees that carried scars from centuries of Aboriginal use. And because scar trees are less dramatic and less visually striking than stone structures or rock art, they have received less attention from heritage authorities and less protection under cultural heritage legislation. Every scar tree that falls or is removed takes with it a piece of evidence that cannot be replaced, a physical record of Aboriginal life and activity that is as unique and irreplaceable as any artifact in any museum collection. And unlike museum artifacts, scar trees are contextual. Their significance depends in part on their location in the landscape, their relationship to other trees, to waterways, to camping sites, and to the broader pattern of Aboriginal land use. Remove a scar tree from its context, and you lose much of the information it carries. Number 22, the possum skin cloaks, wearable art and portable wealth. In the cooler regions of southeastern Australia, Aboriginal people made and wore cloaks constructed from the skins of possums. These were not simple, unadorned garments. They were works of art, meticulously crafted and elaborately decorated, each one representing weeks or months of labor and carrying cultural significance that extended far beyond their function as clothing. The construction of a possum skin cloak was a complex, multi-stage process. First, the possums had to be trapped and skinned, a task that required knowledge of possum behavior, habitat, and seasonal patterns. The skins then had to be cured, scraped to remove fat and tissue, and softened by repeated working, stretching, and rubbing the hide until it was supple enough to be folded and shaped. The individual skins were then sewn together using sinew or plant fiber thread, with bone awls used to punch the stitching holes. A full-size cloak required the skins of 40 to 70 possums, depending on the size of the wearer and the species of possum used. The skins were arranged in overlapping rows, with the fur facing inward for warmth. The outer surface, the skin side, was then decorated with incised or painted designs. The designs on possum skin cloaks were not purely decorative. They encoded information about the wearer's identity, their clan affiliation, their country, and their personal history. Some designs depicted elements of the landscape, rivers, mountains, lakes, and significant sites. Some represented dreaming stories associated with the wearer's country. Some marked events in the wearer's life, ceremonies they had participated in, journeys they had undertaken, knowledge they had acquired. In this sense, a possum skin cloak was a wearable map, a personal document that combined the functions of an identity card, a family crest, a geographical atlas, and a biography, all rendered in the symbolic language of Aboriginal artistic tradition. The cloak was not just clothing, it was a statement of identity, a record of belonging, and a testament to the skill and patience of its maker. Possum skin cloaks were also items of significant economic value. The labor required to make one was substantial, and the finished product was a prestige item that conferred status on its owner. Cloaks were traded, gifted, and inherited, moving through the same exchange networks that carried stone axes, ochre, shells, and other valued goods. A fine cloak was a form of portable wealth, easily transported and universally recognized as an item of worth. When Europeans arrived in southeastern Australia, they frequently commented on the possum skin cloaks worn by the Aboriginal people they encountered. Some early observers were impressed by the quality of the craftsmanship and the complexity of the designs. Others dismissed them as primitive coverings, failing to recognize the cultural depth and artistic sophistication that they represented. The colonial period was devastating for the cloak-making tradition. The introduction of European clothing, combined with the disruption of Aboriginal social systems and the decline of possum populations due to land clearing, led to a rapid decline in cloak production. By the early 20th century, very few possum skin cloaks were being made, and the knowledge of how to make them was in danger of being lost entirely. In recent decades, Aboriginal communities in southeastern Australia have undertaken significant efforts to revive the possum skin cloak tradition. New cloaks are being made using traditional techniques, with designs informed by the fragmentary records of historical cloaks and by the cultural knowledge that survived the colonial disruption. The cloak-making process has become a vehicle for cultural recovery that goes far beyond the finished garment, bringing together elders who carry traditional knowledge with younger people who are eager to learn, reconnecting communities with their artistic heritage and with the skills and practices that sustain their ancestors. Number 23, the coastal shell middens, mountains of evidence along every shoreline. The coastline of Australia is one of the longest in the world, stretching for more than 36,000 kilometers around a continent that was, for tens of thousands of years, surrounded by a shallow continental shelf that extended far beyond the present shoreline. Aboriginal people have lived along this coast for as long as they have lived on the continent, and the evidence of their coastal occupation is everywhere if you know where to look. The most visible evidence is the shell middens, accumulated deposits of shellfish remains that line the Australian coast from the tropical north to the temperate south. Some of these middens are small, inconspicuous scatters of shell fragments barely visible in the sand. Others are enormous, stretching for hundreds of meters along the shoreline and standing several meters high, containing literally tons of shell accumulated over thousands of years of continuous use. The shell middens are not just piles of rubbish, they are archives. Each layer of shell represents a period of occupation, a time when people lived on or near that stretch of coast, and harvested shellfish as a component of their diet. The species of shellfish found in the midden tell us what was being eaten and, by extension, what was available in the local marine environment at the time. Changes in species composition through the layers of the midden record changes in marine ecology over time, providing a record of environmental change that complements and sometimes exceeds the resolution of geological and paleontological evidence. The middens also contain non-shell materials, the bones of fish, marine mammals, and birds, stone tools, bone tools, charcoal from cooking fires, and occasionally human burials. These materials provide information about the broader subsistence strategies, technologies, and cultural practices of the coastal communities that created them. The sheer scale of some coastal middens is evidence of large, settled populations that relied on marine resources as a primary food source. The idea that coastal Aboriginal communities were small, transient groups passing through on their way to somewhere else is contradicted by the physical evidence. You do not accumulate a midden several meters high and hundreds of meters long by visiting a beach occasionally. You accumulate it by living there year after year, generation after generation, for hundreds or thousands of years. The coastal middens of Australia are among the oldest in the world. Some date back more than 30,000 years to a time when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, and the coastline was tens or hundreds of kilometers further out than it is now. The oldest middens along the present coastline date to the period following the last glacial maximum, roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago, when rising seas pushed the shoreline back to approximately its present position. But the truly ancient middens, the ones that document the earliest coastal occupation of the continent, are now underwater. As sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, the vast continental shelf that once surrounded Australia was gradually submerged, and the coastal settlements and middens that once lined its shores were drowned. These submerged sites represent a vast, largely unexplored archive of Aboriginal coastal life, potentially containing evidence of some of the earliest seafaring and coastal adaptation anywhere in the world. The scale of what was lost beneath the waves is difficult to comprehend. At the height of the last glacial period, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 120 meters lower than they are today. The coastline of Australia was vastly different from the one we know, with massive coastal plains extending into what is now deep ocean. The Aboriginal communities that lived on these plains and the settlements, middens, and cultural sites they created are now beneath the sea, preserved in some cases but inaccessible to conventional archaeological investigation. This is one of the reasons why the full extent of Aboriginal coastal civilization may never be known. The evidence is there, but much of it is underwater, and the technology to investigate submerged archaeological sites on the scale required is still in its infancy. What we can see along the present coastline, the surviving middens and coastal sites, is only a fraction of the total, the remnant that escaped the rising waters. The rest is down there in the dark, waiting. Number 24. The Rock Art Galleries. 60,000 years of visual storytelling. Australia contains some of the oldest and most extensive rock art traditions anywhere on the planet. From the Kimberley region of Western Australia to the sandstone escarpments of Arnhem Land, from the granite outcrops of the Pilbara to the limestone caves of the Nullarbor, Aboriginal people have been painting, engraving, and stenciling images on rock surfaces for tens of thousands of years, creating one of the longest continuous artistic traditions in human history. The oldest dated rock art in Australia, and potentially in the world, is a painting of a kangaroo in a rock shelter in the Kimberley, dated to approximately 17,300 years ago, using radiocarbon dating of a wasp nest that had been built over the image. Other dating techniques suggest that some rock art in Australia may be even older, potentially extending back to the earliest period of human occupation of the continent, more than 60,000 years ago. The rock art of Australia is not a single tradition. It encompasses a vast diversity of styles, techniques, subject matter, and cultural functions, reflecting the diversity of the hundreds of language groups and cultural regions that make up Aboriginal Australia. In Arnhem Land, the X-ray style depicts animals with their internal organs and skeletal structures visible, combining artistic representation with biological knowledge. In the Kimberley, the Wandjina figures, distinctive large-eyed spirit beings associated with rain and fertility, dominate the rock shelters. In the Pilbara, the deep engravings known as petroglyphs depict animals, human figures, and abstract designs on the dark weathered surfaces of ancient rock. But rock art is not just art, it is communication, it is education, it is law, it is ceremony. The images painted and engraved on rock surfaces across Australia serve multiple functions simultaneously, encoding information about the natural world, the spiritual world, the social world, and the historical world in a visual language that was understood by those who had been taught to read it. Some rock art depicts practical information about the environment, the species of animals and plants found in the area, the locations of water sources, the seasonal patterns of resource availability. Some depict ceremonial events, recording the dances, songs, and rituals that formed the core of Aboriginal cultural life. Some records historical events, encounters between groups, conflicts, natural disasters, and, in some of the most recent examples, the arrival of European ships and people. The rock art galleries of Australia are under threat from the same forces that threaten other Aboriginal cultural sites. Weathering, erosion, and the growth of mineral deposits on rock surfaces are gradually obscuring and destroying images that have survived for thousands of years. Vandalism, both deliberate and accidental, has damaged numerous sites. Mining, development, and infrastructure construction have destroyed others, and the acidification of rainwater due to atmospheric pollution is accelerating the chemical weathering of the rock surfaces on which the art is painted. Some of the most significant rock art sites in Australia are in remote areas, difficult to access and difficult to protect. The sheer number of sites, estimated in the hundreds of thousands across the continent, means that only a tiny fraction have been formally recorded, let alone studied or conserved. Many sites are known only to local Aboriginal communities, who maintain them as part of their cultural obligations. Others have been forgotten, their locations lost along with the cultural knowledge that once sustained them. The loss of rock art is irreversible. Unlike a building that can be reconstructed or a language that can be revitalized, a destroyed rock art panel cannot be recreated. The pigments, the techniques, the cultural context, and the artistic vision that created it are gone, along with whatever information the image was intended to convey. Each panel that is lost represents the erasure of a chapter in the longest continuous record of human artistic expression on Earth. Number 25. The Lake Mungo burials, ritual, ceremony, and the deep antiquity of the human spirit. In the dry lake country of Western New South Wales, on the shores of a lake that has been dry for thousands of years, there are burials that have fundamentally altered our understanding of human cultural development. The Lake Mungo burials, discovered in the 1960s and 1970s, include some of the oldest known examples of ritual burial and cremation anywhere in the world, and they tell a story of cultural sophistication that reaches back to the very dawn of human consciousness. The most famous of the Lake Mungo remains is known as Mungo Lady, the cremated remains of a young woman dated to approximately 42,000 years ago. Her body was cremated, the bones were then collected, crushed, and placed in a small pit, which was then covered with earth. This is not the disposal of a corpse. This is a ritual, a deliberate multi-stage process that implies a set of beliefs about death, the body and the afterlife that is as complex and as deeply felt as anything found in any later human culture. The other significant burial at Lake Mungo is known as Mungo Man, the remains of an adult male dated to approximately 40,000 years ago. His body was laid out with his hands clasped together, and he was covered with red ochre, a pigment that had to be transported to the burial site from sources located some distance away. The use of ochre in burial contexts is widely interpreted as evidence of symbolic behavior, the deliberate use of color in a ritual context to convey meaning beyond the purely practical. Together, the Mungo Lady and Mungo Man burials demonstrate that the Aboriginal people living in this region more than 40,000 years ago had developed complex belief systems, ritual practices, and symbolic behaviors that are among the earliest known examples of such behaviors in the human archaeological record. They were not surviving. They were creating culture, inventing meaning, and developing the kind of spiritual and ceremonial life that we associate with fully modern human consciousness. The Lake Mungo region also contains extensive evidence of other aspects of Aboriginal life during this period. There are hearths, stone tools, animal bones, and the remains of freshwater fish and shellfish, evidence of a diverse subsistence economy supported by the rich resources of the then full lake and its surrounding landscape. There are footprints preserved in the clay of the ancient lake shore that provide a snapshot of daily life, people walking, running, hunting, going about the ordinary business of living in a landscape that has since been transformed by tens of thousands of years of environmental change. The footprints are particularly evocative. Dated to roughly 20,000 years ago, they include the prints of adults, children, and what appears to be a one-legged person using some kind of support, hopping along the lake shore alongside their companions. These are not abstractions. These are the literal traces of individual human beings, people with families and communities and daily routines, going about their lives on the shores of a lake that no longer exists, in a landscape that has changed beyond recognition. The Lake Mungo evidence is part of a broader pattern of deep time Aboriginal cultural development that is documented across Australia. The earliest evidence of human occupation of the continent, dating to at least 65,000 years ago, at the Majed Baby Rock Shelter in Arnhem Land, includes stone tools, ground ochre, and other artifacts that indicate a technologically capable and culturally active population from the very beginning of the Australian human story. This deep antiquity matters because it challenges the notion that Aboriginal Australia was static, unchanging, a society frozen in time until the Europeans arrived to set history in motion. The archaeological record shows the opposite, a dynamic, evolving, innovative society that adapted to dramatic environmental changes, including ice ages, sea level fluctuations, volcanic eruptions, and shifts in climate and ecology over tens of thousands of years. The stone cities, the aquaculture systems, the agricultural practices, and the cultural institutions that existed at the time of European contact were not relics of a distant past. They were the latest iterations of a continuously developing civilization that had been innovating and adapting for longer than any other society on Earth. Number 26. What the first Europeans actually saw and then chose to forget. The earliest European accounts of Aboriginal Australia contain descriptions that should have prevented the myth of the primitive nomad from ever taking hold. These descriptions are not hidden. They are in published journals, official reports, and personal correspondence available to anyone who cares to read them. And yet, for more than 2 centuries, they were systematically ignored, downplayed, or reinterpreted to fit the narrative that colonization required. William Buckley, an escaped convict who lived with Aboriginal people in the Bellarine Peninsula region of Victoria for 32 years before being found by European settlers in 1835, described a society that was organized, complex, and far from primitive. He described permanent settlements, organized food production, sophisticated social systems, and cultural practices of great depth and richness. His account was published but largely dismissed, treated as unreliable because it contradicted the emerging colonial narrative. George Augustus Robinson's journals, as mentioned earlier, contain detailed descriptions of the stone villages, aquaculture systems, and dense populations of the Western District. These journals were filed in government archives, where they remained largely unread for more than a century. When researchers finally began to examine them in the late 20th century, they found descriptions of a civilization that bore no resemblance to the stereotype of the wandering nomad. Thomas Mitchell's accounts of his expeditions through southeastern Australia in the 1830s describe landscapes that looked managed, park-like, with grassy plains, widely spaced trees, and evidence of systematic burning. He described fields of yam daisies that resembled cultivated farmland. He noted the large populations he encountered and the evidence of permanent or semi-permanent occupation. His observations were published and read widely, but the implications were not pursued. These are not obscure sources. They are the foundational documents of Australian colonial history. And yet the information they contain about stone houses, aquaculture, agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex social organization was effectively written out of the historical narrative. The process of erasure was not a conspiracy. It was something more insidious, a collective unwillingness to see what was plainly visible, because seeing it would have required acknowledging that the colonization of Australia involved the destruction of a civilization, not the occupation of an empty wilderness. The consequences of this willful blindness are still being felt. The myth of the primitive nomad shaped government policy toward Aboriginal people for 2 centuries. It justified dispossession, forced removal, cultural suppression, and institutional neglect. It informed educational curricula that taught generations of Australian children that their continent had no history before 1788. And it created a historical amnesia so deep and so pervasive that even now in the 21st century, many Australians are genuinely surprised to learn that Aboriginal people built stone houses engineered waterways, practiced agriculture, and created the oldest known works of art on Earth. The stone cities were always there. The evidence was always visible. The first-hand accounts were always available. The choice to ignore them was exactly that, a choice. And the consequences of that choice have shaped the history, the politics, the culture, and the moral landscape of an entire nation. Number 27, the recovery. What is being found, what is being saved, and what is already gone? The story of Aboriginal Australia is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of survival, resilience, and recovery. Despite 2 centuries of dispossession, suppression, and deliberate cultural destruction, Aboriginal people have maintained their identity, their connection to country, and significant elements of the knowledge systems that sustained their civilization for tens of thousands of years. The recovery of Aboriginal cultural heritage is happening on multiple fronts. Archaeological research is continuing to uncover new evidence of the extent and sophistication of pre-contact Aboriginal civilization. The Budj Bim system has been recognized by UNESCO. The Brewarina fish traps are being restored. Stone arrangements are being mapped and documented. Rock art is being recorded using digital technologies that can preserve images even after the original surfaces have deteriorated. Aboriginal communities are leading much of this recovery work. Traditional knowledge holders are working with researchers to document and preserve the cultural knowledge that survived the colonial period. Language revitalization programs are bringing dormant languages back into active use. Cultural practices, including firestick farming, possum skin cloak making, and ceremonial performance, are being revived and taught to new generations. The legal framework for the protection of Aboriginal cultural heritage has improved, although it remains inadequate in many respects. The Mabo decision of 1992 and the subsequent Native Title Act established a legal basis for Aboriginal land rights. State and federal heritage legislation provides some protection for cultural sites, although enforcement is inconsistent and the penalties for destruction are often too low to serve as effective deterrents. But the scale of what has been lost cannot be overstated. The knowledge systems that sustained Aboriginal civilization for 60,000 years were not static collections of facts. They were dynamic, living systems that required continuous practice, transmission, and renewal. The interruption of this process during the colonial period caused losses that cannot be fully recovered, regardless of how much effort is invested. Some languages are gone forever, their last speakers having died without passing on their knowledge. Some songlines are broken, their sequences forgotten, their navigational information lost. Some ceremonial practices have been discontinued for so long that the specific knowledge required to perform them correctly has been forgotten. Some ecological management techniques are no longer practiced, and the landscapes they once maintained have changed beyond the point where they could be restored. The recovery work that is happening now is vitally important, but it is also a race against time. The elders who carry the remaining traditional knowledge are aging, and each one who passes takes with them information that may never be recovered. The landscapes that once bore the physical evidence of Aboriginal civilization are continuing to be altered by development, farming, mining, and climate change. And the cultural conditions that made Aboriginal knowledge systems possible, communities living on country, speaking their languages, performing their ceremonies, and practicing their skills, are still difficult to maintain in the face of ongoing social and economic challenges. Number 28. The question nobody asks. What would Australia look like if nothing had been erased? Imagine for a moment what Australia might look like today if the stone cities had never been destroyed. If the aquaculture channels of Budgebim were still flowing, if the fish traps of Brew Arena were still functioning, if the yam daisy fields of the Western District were still feeding thousands, if the stone houses of Lake Condah were still standing, if the firestick farming practices that had shaped the continent for 60,000 years had never been interrupted. Imagine a landscape where the bushfires that now devastate communities every summer were rare, controlled by the careful, systematic burning that had prevented fuel buildup for millennia. Imagine rivers and wetlands that teemed with fish managed by aquaculture systems that had been refined over 6,000 years of continuous operation. Imagine a countryside dotted with permanent settlements, connected by trade routes that carried goods, songs, and knowledge across thousands of kilometers. Imagine a knowledge system that had been accumulating, refining, and transmitting information for 65,000 years without interruption. Imagine the astronomical observations, the ecological insights, the engineering innovations, the medical knowledge, the artistic traditions, and the philosophical frameworks that such a system might have produced. Imagine what we might have learned from it, what it might have taught us about sustainable living, about ecological management, about the relationship between human societies and the natural systems that support them. This is not romantic speculation. The evidence shows that Aboriginal Australia had developed sophisticated, effective, and sustainable systems for managing the landscape, producing food, building shelter, and organizing society. These systems worked. They worked for longer than any other comparable systems in human history. They supported a healthy, well-fed, culturally rich population across an entire continent, including some of the most challenging environments on Earth. And they were destroyed. Not by their own inadequacy, not by natural disaster, not by the inevitable march of progress. They were destroyed by a colonial project that could not afford to recognize their existence, because recognition would have undermined the legal, moral, and ideological foundations upon which the entire enterprise depended. The stone cities of Australia were not erased overnight by some mysterious cataclysm. They were erased by a very specific, very identifiable set of human decisions, driven by greed, justified by racism, enabled by ignorance, and sustained by a willful refusal to see what was plainly visible. And the question that follows from this recognition is not just historical, it is urgent and contemporary. What are we still failing to see? What knowledge are we still destroying? What civilizations are we still dismissing because they do not look the way we expect civilizations to look? The stone cities of Australia were real. The aquaculture systems were real. The agricultural practices were real. The astronomical observatories were real. The trade networks, the political systems, the engineering projects, the artistic traditions, they were all real. They existed for thousands of years on this continent, sustained by the knowledge, labor, and ingenuity of people who understood their land more deeply and more completely than anyone who has come after them. And they deserve to be remembered. Not as curiosities, not as footnotes, not as exceptions to the myth of the primitive nomad. They deserve to be remembered as what they were, the achievements of one of the oldest, most enduring, and most remarkable civilizations in the history of the human species. The next time someone tells you that Australia had no civilization before 1788, you can tell them about the stone houses that are older than the pyramids. You can tell them about the aquaculture system that was operating for 4,000 years before anyone in Mesopotamia thought to dig a canal. You can tell them about the fish traps that may be the oldest human-made structures on the planet. You can tell them about the astronomical observatory that tracked the stars before Stonehenge was a hole in the ground. You can tell them about the grinding stones that prove bread was being baked in Australia 20,000 years before it was baked anywhere else. And then you can tell them the hardest part, that all of this was known, that it was recorded by the first Europeans who saw it, that it was visible in the landscape for anyone who cared to look, and that it was deliberately, systematically, and almost completely erased, not by time, not by nature, but by people who chose not to see what was right in front of them. The stone cities are still there, some of them, buried under paddocks, hidden in bushland, submerged beneath reservoirs, scattered across landscapes that have been plowed, grazed, mined, and built over. They are there waiting to be seen, waiting to be understood, waiting to be remembered. And now you know, if you made it this far, you are not a casual viewer. You are the kind of person who wants to understand the history that was hidden. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one. But we are not done yet, because there are places on this continent, sites that have barely been studied, structures that have barely been mapped, that suggest the story we have just told is only the beginning, that the scope of what existed here before the erasure was even larger than the evidence we have already discussed. Number 29. The Bogong Moth Feasts, a seasonal harvest in the Alpine country. Every spring in the high country of the Australian Alps, something extraordinary happened. Billions of bogong moths migrated from the lowland plains of Queensland and New South Wales to the granite peaks of the Snowy Mountains, seeking cool, dark crevices in the rocks, where they could spend the summer months in a state of dormancy called aestivation. And every spring, Aboriginal people from across southeastern Australia made their own migration to meet them. The Bogong Moth Feasts were among the largest and most significant intergroup gatherings in Aboriginal Australia. People from multiple language groups, some travelling hundreds of kilometres from the coast, the inland plains, and the river valleys, converged on the high country to harvest the moths, which were an extraordinarily rich food source. A single bogong moth contains more energy per gram than most meats, with a fat content that made them a caloric powerhouse in a landscape where concentrated fats were otherwise scarce. The harvesting technique was simple but effective. The moths clustered in dense masses on the walls and ceilings of granite caves and crevices. Aboriginal people used smouldering fires or smoking branches to stun the moths, causing them to fall from the rock surfaces in large numbers. The fallen moths were collected, their wings and legs removed, and the bodies roasted on hot stones or in the ashes of fires. The roasted moths could be eaten immediately, or ground into a paste and formed into cakes that could be stored and transported. The quantities harvested were enormous. Early European observers described Aboriginal people consuming moths by the bushel during the feasting season, and the cakes produced from the roasted moths were traded and transported far from the mountains, providing a concentrated portable food source that supplemented the diet of communities across a wide area. But the bogong moth gatherings were about far more than food, like the Brewarana fish trap gatherings. The Alpine feasts were occasions for ceremony, trade, marriage negotiation, dispute resolution, and the renewal of intergroup relationships. People who lived in different ecological zones, spoke different languages, and followed different seasonal patterns came together into mountains for weeks at a time, conducting the business of a continental society. The gathering sites in the mountains show evidence of sustained, repeated use over thousands of years. There are hearths, stone tools, grinding stones, and the accumulated debris of countless seasons of occupation. Some sites contain deep deposits of moth remains, charred wings, and bodies compressed into layers that record the annual visits of Aboriginal people to the same locations over millennia. The Bogong moth feasts demonstrate a principle that runs through much of Aboriginal Australian life: the integration of ecological knowledge, food production, social organisation, and cultural practice into a unified system. The moths were not just food. The migration to the mountains was not just a foraging trip. It was a seasonal rhythm that structured social life across a vast area, bringing people together at predictable times and places for purposes that combined the practical and the ceremonial in ways that European observers often struggled to comprehend. When European settlement disrupted the seasonal patterns of Aboriginal life, the Bogong moth gatherings declined and eventually ceased. The people who had once traveled to the mountains every spring were confined to missions and reserves, unable to make the journey. The traditional knowledge of moth harvesting, preparation, and trade began to fade, and the moths themselves, their habitat altered by grazing, logging, and climate change, have declined in numbers dramatically in recent decades, threatening the ecological foundation of a tradition that sustained Aboriginal communities for thousands of years. Number 30. The Aboriginal wells and water engineering of the arid interior. The arid interior of Australia is one of the most water-scarce environments on Earth. Rainfall is minimal and unpredictable. Surface water is rare and ephemeral. Temperatures in summer can exceed 50 degrees Celsius. And yet, Aboriginal people lived in this environment. Not just survived, but lived for tens of thousands of years. They did it, in part, through an intimate knowledge of water and a suite of water management technologies that were adapted to the specific conditions of the arid landscape. These technologies were not dramatic. They were not the great dams and canals of hydraulic civilizations in other parts of the world. They were subtle, effective, and perfectly scaled to the environment in which they operated. One of the most important of these technologies was the native well. Aboriginal people across the arid interior dug wells to access groundwater, sometimes reaching depths of several meters, using nothing more than digging sticks and bare hands. The wells were not randomly placed. They were dug at locations where geological knowledge, accumulated over countless generations, indicated that groundwater was accessible at the bases of sand dunes, at the edges of clay pans, along the margins of dry creek beds where subsurface water persisted even when the surface was bone dry. Some wells were elaborately constructed, with walls of sticks or stones to prevent the soft sand from collapsing back into the hole. Some were covered with branches and sand to reduce evaporation and prevent animals from fouling the water. Some were marked with stone arrangements or other indicators that allowed travelers to locate them across the featureless desert landscape. The wells were not just water sources, they were territorial markers, cultural sites, and nodes in the web of knowledge and obligation that connected communities across the desert. Knowledge of well locations was shared through the song lines, encoded in songs that described travel routes across the arid landscape and identified the water sources along the way. This knowledge was not freely available. It was managed and controlled, shared with those who had the social and ceremonial connections that entitled them to travel through a particular area and use its water resources. The management of water in the arid interior extended beyond well digging. Aboriginal people used a range of techniques to capture, store, and distribute water, including the construction of small dams and weirs on ephemeral waterways, the use of tree hollows as natural cisterns, the collection of dew and condensation, and the extraction of moisture from plant tissues. They understood the hydrology of their country at a level of detail that enabled them to live in environments where modern travelers, equipped with GPS, satellite phones, and four-wheel drives, still sometimes perish from dehydration. The European explorers who ventured into the arid interior in the 19th century were frequently dependent on Aboriginal water knowledge for their survival. Many of them recorded, with varying degrees of acknowledgement, that they had been guided to water sources by Aboriginal people or had found wells that had been dug by Aboriginal hands. Some of these wells are still in use today, maintained by pastoral stations that have been drawing on Aboriginal water engineering for more than a century. The irony is that the people who engineered these water systems, who maintained them, who encoded the knowledge of their locations in songs and stories, were the same people who were being dispossessed and displaced by the colonists who depended on their knowledge. The water that sustained the pastoral economy of the arid interior was, in many cases, water that Aboriginal people had found, accessed, and managed long before any European set foot on the continent. Number 31. The Kuyang economy, how eel farming built a civilization. We have already discussed the Budj Bim aquaculture system and its physical infrastructure. But the full economic significance of the system only becomes apparent when you consider the broader economic framework in which it operated. The system known to the Gunditjmara people as the Kuyang economy, named after the short-finned eel that was its foundation. The short-finned eel, Anguilla australis, has a complex life cycle that takes it from the freshwater rivers and wetlands of southeastern Australia to the deep ocean and back again. The eels breed in the deep waters of the Coral Sea, and their larvae drift south on ocean currents, eventually entering the rivers and streams of the southeastern coast and making their way upstream to the freshwater habitats where they will spend most of their adult lives. When they reach maturity after a period that can extend to 20 years or more, they migrate back downstream to the ocean to breed and die. The Gunditjmara understood this life cycle intimately. Their aquaculture system was designed to intercept the eels at specific points in their migration, trapping them in artificial ponds and channels where they could be fattened, harvested, and processed. The timing of the harvest was calibrated to the eel's seasonal movements, ensuring that enough eels were allowed to pass through this system to maintain the breeding population. The processed eels were not consumed solely by the Gunditjmara. They were a trade commodity, smoked and dried using techniques that preserved them for weeks or months, allowing them to be transported over long distances. Smoked eel from the Budj Bim region was traded north to the Murray River corridor, east to the Goldfields country, south to the coast, and west toward the South Australian border. The trade networks that distributed the eel connected the Gunditjmara to dozens of other groups and gave them access to resources that were not available in their own territory: stone for tools, ochre for ceremony, shells for ornament, and possum skins for cloaks. The eel economy was not just an exchange of goods, it was a system of social and political relationships. The trade in eels established and maintained alliances between groups, created obligations of reciprocity and mutual support, and provided the economic foundation for the large intergroup gatherings that were a central feature of Aboriginal social life in southeastern Australia. The wealth generated by the eel economy supported a population density in the Western District of Victoria that was among the highest in pre-contact Australia. The permanent stone villages, the elaborate aquaculture infrastructure, and the complex social organization of the Gunditjmara were all sustained, directly or indirectly, by the productivity of the Kuyang economy. The eels were not just food, they were the foundation of a civilization. This is a point worth pausing on, because it challenges one of the most persistent assumptions about the nature of civilization itself. In the conventional narrative of human history, civilization is a product of grain agriculture. The theory holds that the domestication of grains in the Fertile Crescent, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, enabled the production of surplus food, which in turn supported population growth, permanent settlement, occupational specialization, and the development of complex social and political institutions. Civilization in this model begins with wheat. The Gunditjmara offer a different model. Their civilization was based not on grain, but on eels. Their surplus was not stored in granaries, but in smoked eel caches. Their infrastructure was not irrigation canals for cropland, but aquaculture channels for eel farming. Their trade was not in agricultural commodities, but in preserved protein. But the outcomes were the same: permanent settlement, population density, complex social organization, long-distance trade, and cultural continuity over thousands of years. The fact that the Gunditjmara achieved all of this without grain agriculture does not make their civilization less impressive. If anything, it makes it more so, because it demonstrates that the path to settled, complex, sustainable living is not a single road, but a landscape of possibilities, and that human ingenuity is capable of finding routes to civilization that conventional models do not predict. Number 32, the night sky knowledge, astronomy that shaped agriculture and ceremony. Aboriginal astronomical knowledge extends far beyond the stone arrangements at Wurrdyuang. Across the continent, Aboriginal people developed sophisticated understandings of the night sky that informed their agricultural practices, their ceremonial calendars, their navigation, and their philosophical understanding of the cosmos. One of the most distinctive features of Aboriginal astronomy is the use of dark constellations, patterns formed not by the stars themselves, but by the dark spaces between them, the dust lanes and nebula of the Milky Way that create silhouettes against the background glow. The most famous of these is the Emu in the Sky, a dark constellation visible in the Milky Way from roughly April to July, whose outline traces the shape of an emu, Australia's largest bird, running across the sky. The emu in the sky is not just a pattern, it is a practical tool. When the celestial emu is in a particular position in the sky, real emus on the ground are laying their eggs. The appearance of the emu constellation signals the beginning of the egg-laying season. telling Aboriginal people when to start searching for emu nests. This is astronomy in the service of ecology, celestial observation linked directly to food production. Similar connections between astronomical events and terrestrial conditions have been documented across Aboriginal Australia. The rising of the Pleiades star cluster signals the beginning of the dingo breeding season in some regions and the onset of winter weather in others. The position of specific stars or constellations at particular times of night indicates the availability of specific food resources, the timing of seasonal migrations, and the appropriate dates for ceremonial activities. Aboriginal astronomical knowledge also includes an understanding of the movements of the sun and moon that goes beyond simple observation. Some Aboriginal groups have developed models of solar and lunar motion that account for the changing positions of sunrise and sunset throughout the year, the phases of the moon, and the relationship between lunar cycles and tidal patterns. These models were not expressed in the mathematical formalism of Western astronomy, but they were functionally accurate and practically useful, enabling predictions about seasonal conditions, tidal movements, and the timing of ecological events. The intellectual achievement represented by Aboriginal astronomy is considerable. The systematic observation of celestial phenomena over thousands of years, the identification of correlations between astronomical events and terrestrial conditions, the encoding of this knowledge in songs, stories, and physical structures like Wurdi Yuwang, and the transmission of this knowledge across generations through oral tradition, all of this constitutes a scientific enterprise of genuine sophistication. It is different in form from Western science, but it is not different in kind. It involves observation, hypothesis, testing, and the accumulation of verified knowledge over time. It is, by any reasonable definition, science. Number 33. The intercontinental seafaring. How people reached Australia in the first place. The story of Aboriginal Australia begins with an act of seafaring so extraordinary that it was, for a long time, considered impossible. The first people to reach Australia had to cross a significant stretch of open ocean, possibly as much as 90 kilometers of open water at the narrowest point between the islands of Southeast Asia and the Australian New Guinean landmass. They did this at least 65,000 years ago and possibly earlier. To understand the significance of this achievement, consider what it implies. The first Australians had to build watercraft capable of carrying people across open ocean. They had to navigate either by direct observation or by knowledge of ocean currents and wind patterns to a destination that was invisible over the horizon. They had to carry enough food and water for the journey, or know how to obtain both at sea. And they had to make the decision to embark on such a journey in the first place, to look at the open ocean and decide to cross it, without any certainty about what lay on the other side. This is the earliest known evidence of ocean-going seafaring by human beings. The colonization of Australia by sea predates any comparable maritime achievement anywhere else in the world by tens of thousands of years. It implies cognitive capabilities, planning, communication, innovation, and risk assessment that are fully modern in every sense. And the journey did not end at the coast. Once the first Australians arrived, they spread across the continent with remarkable speed, reaching the most remote corners of the landmass within a few thousand years. They adapted to environments ranging from tropical rainforest to arid desert, from alpine highlands to coastal wetlands. They developed technologies, subsistence strategies, and cultural practices suited to each environment, creating a diversity of lifestyles and economies that reflected the ecological diversity of the continent itself. The seafaring capabilities of Aboriginal Australians did not end with the initial colonization. There is evidence of ongoing maritime trade and travel between Australia and the islands of Southeast Asia, extending back thousands of years. The people of the Torres Strait Islands, the chain of islands between the northern tip of Australia and Papua New Guinea, maintained trading relationships with both their southern and northern neighbours, exchanging goods, knowledge, and cultural practices across the maritime frontier. On the northern coast of Australia, Aboriginal communities had regular contact with Macassan traders from the island of Sulawesi in present-day Indonesia, who visited the Australian coast every year during the monsoon season to harvest sea cucumbers, which were dried and exported to China. This trade relationship extended back at least several centuries before European contact and involved the exchange of goods, the temporary cohabitation of Aboriginal and Macassan people on the Australian coast, and the transfer of technologies and cultural practices between the two groups. The evidence for this contact is found in the archaeological record of the northern coast, in the form of Macassan pottery, glass beads, metal tools, and the stone platforms used to process sea cucumbers. It is also found in Aboriginal art, which depicts Macassan sailing vessels, and in the Yolngu language of Arnhem Land, which contains numerous loanwords from the Macassan Malay language. The Macassan trade is significant because it demonstrates that Aboriginal Australia was not isolated from the rest of the world. Aboriginal communities on the northern coast participated in an international trading economy that connected them, through the Macassan middlemen, to the vast commercial networks of maritime Southeast Asia, and ultimately to the markets of Imperial China. This was not a closed, self-contained society. It was a society connected to the wider world through trade, travel, and cultural exchange, maintaining those connections for centuries on its own terms. Number 34. The living knowledge holders, what still survives and who carries it. Despite everything that has been described in this account, despite the disease, the displacement, the dispossession, the suppression, and the destruction, Aboriginal knowledge has not been entirely lost. It persists, carried by the living knowledge holders who have maintained the chain of transmission across generations, sometimes in the face of overwhelming adversity. In communities across Australia, elders continue to hold knowledge of country, of language, of ceremony, of ecological management, of astronomical observation, of law, and of the dreaming stories that give meaning and structure to all of these domains. This knowledge is not uniform. It is as diverse as the hundreds of language groups and cultural regions that make up Aboriginal Australia, each with its own specific traditions, practices, and understandings. Some of this knowledge is being actively revitalized. Language programs are teaching young people to speak tongues that were on the verge of extinction. Cultural camps are bringing communities back to country, reconnecting people with the landscapes and practices that their grandparents were forced to leave behind. Traditional burning programs are being reintroduced, with Aboriginal fire practitioners working alongside modern land managers to restore the fire regimes that maintained the landscape for thousands of years. The Gunditjmara have returned to Bujbim. They are working to restore the aquaculture channels, to rebuild the weirs, and to re-establish the eel economy that sustained their community for 6,000 years. The UNESCO World Heritage listing has brought international recognition and resources, and the Gunditjmara are using both to reclaim their heritage and build a future that is rooted in their past. At Brewarina, the Ngemba and other traditional custodians are working to restore the fish traps and to re-establish them as a functioning food production system and a gathering place for intergroup ceremony and exchange. The work is slow and underfunded, but it is happening. Across the continent, Aboriginal artists are painting, carving, weaving, and sculpting in traditions that extend back thousands of years, producing works that are recognized internationally for their artistic power and cultural depth. Aboriginal musicians are performing songs that carry encoded knowledge of country, season, and ceremony. Aboriginal dancers are performing ceremonies that connect the present to the deep past, maintaining the dreaming stories that give meaning to the landscape and to the lives of the people who belong to it. This is not a dead civilization being studied by archaeologists. This is a living civilization, wounded and diminished by 2 centuries of colonial violence, but alive, resilient, and actively engaged in the process of recovery and renewal. The stone cities may be in ruins, but the knowledge that built them has not been entirely lost. The aquaculture channels may be silted and overgrown, but the understanding of how they worked still exists. The songlines may be broken in places, but many of them are still being sung. The question now is whether Australian society and the world will support the recovery of this civilization or continue to let it slip away. The knowledge that Aboriginal people carry is not just of historical interest, it has practical value for the future. Fire management techniques developed over thousands of years could help prevent the catastrophic bushfires that are becoming increasingly common as the climate changes. Water management strategies refined in the world's driest inhabited continent could inform water policy in an era of growing scarcity. Agricultural practices that sustain large populations without destroying the soil could offer alternatives to the industrial farming systems that are degrading ecosystems around the world. And the philosophical and ecological frameworks that guided Aboriginal land management, frameworks based on the principle that human beings are part of the natural world rather than its masters, could inform the broader shift in thinking that the environmental crises of the 21st century demand. The stone cities of Australia were real. They were built by people of extraordinary intelligence, creativity, and determination. They were sustained by knowledge systems of remarkable depth and sophistication, and they were destroyed by a colonial project that could not afford to see them for what they were. Now we can see them. The question is what we do with what we see. And that, right there, is the story that the history books left out. 65,000 years of civilization on the oldest continent on Earth, built in stone, engineered in water, encoded in song, and very nearly erased from human memory. But not quite, not entirely, not yet. Sleep well. And remember what you heard here. But before you drift off, there are a few more things you should know. A few more pieces of this story that are too important to leave out. Number 35, the stone fish traps of the Darling River system, an infrastructure network spanning thousands of kilometers. The fish traps at Brewarina are the most famous, but they were not unique. Stone fish traps were built along rivers across the Australian continent, from the tropical streams of the top end to the cold rivers of the southeast. Along the Darling River and its tributaries alone, there were dozens of fish trap systems, each one designed and built by the local Aboriginal community to harvest the fish that migrated along the river system with the seasonal floods. The Darling River fish traps varied in design depending on the local conditions, the width and depth of the river, the species of fish being targeted, and the characteristics of the available stone. Some were simple weirs, low walls of stone that channeled fish into narrow openings where they could be easily captured. Others were more complex, with multiple chambers and channels that separated fish by size and species, allowing selective harvesting similar to the practices observed at Brewarina. The traps were not permanent in the way that a modern dam is permanent. They were built with the understanding that seasonal floods would damage or destroy them, and they were rebuilt and maintained on an annual basis. The annual rebuilding of the fish traps was itself a communal activity, bringing together members of the local group and sometimes visitors from neighboring areas to participate in the physical labor and the social and ceremonial activities that accompanied it. The maintenance of fish traps along the length of a major river system required coordination between the groups who lived along different sections of the river. Fish that were allowed to pass through the traps at one location would be caught at traps further downstream. The population of fish in the river was a shared resource that required cooperative management, and the protocols for this management were embedded in the same systems of law, ceremony, and kinship obligation that governed other aspects of intergroup relations. The fish trap systems of the Darling River represent a form of cooperative resource management that operated across hundreds of kilometers of river, involving dozens of independent groups, without any centralized authority to coordinate their actions. The coordination was achieved through cultural mechanisms, shared stories, shared ceremonies, kinship networks, and the mutual understanding that the health of the fishery depended on the responsible behavior of everyone who used it. This is a model of distributed governance and cooperative resource management that has attracted the attention of modern environmental scientists and policy makers, who are increasingly recognizing that centralized top-down approaches to natural resource management often fail, particularly in large, complex systems like river basins. The Aboriginal model, based on distributed custodianship, reciprocal obligation, and culturally embedded management protocols, offers an alternative that is worth studying and, where possible, emulating. The fish traps of the Darling River system are mostly gone now. The river has been dammed, diverted, and depleted by irrigation, and the seasonal flood patterns that the traps depended on have been fundamentally altered. The fish populations that once sustained large Aboriginal communities along the river have been decimated by overfishing, habitat destruction, and the introduction of non-native species like European carp. The river that was once the backbone of a thriving economy and a rich cultural landscape is now, in many places, a depleted, degraded waterway struggling to support even a fraction of the life it once sustained. Number 36. The clan estates and political boundaries, a continent of nations, not an empty land. One of the most important concepts for understanding Aboriginal Australia is the idea of the clan estate, the defined territory associated with a specific clan or family group. Every part of Australia belonged to someone. Every piece of country had a custodian, a group or individual who was responsible for its care, maintenance, and the performance of the ceremonies that ensured its ongoing spiritual and ecological health. The boundaries of clan estates were not arbitrary. They were defined by features of the landscape, rivers, ridgelines, rock formations, and other natural markers that served as territorial boundaries. These boundaries were known to everyone in the region and were respected as firmly as any national border in the modern world. Crossing into another group's territory without permission was a serious matter, subject to social and sometimes physical sanctions. The system of clan estates meant that the entire continent was, in effect, divided into hundreds of distinct territories, each managed by its own custodial group according to its own specific set of cultural practices and ecological knowledge. The result was a patchwork of land management regimes, each one adapted to the specific conditions of the territory it covered, that together constituted a continental scale system of environmental governance. This system has been mapped imperfectly and incompletely by modern researchers, and the maps that have been produced are revelatory. They show a continent divided into more than 500 distinct language groups, each associated with a defined territory, each with its own laws, customs, ecological knowledge, and cultural practices. The maps look like the political maps of Europe or Asia, dense mosaics of distinct polities covering every corner of the landmass. They are the maps of a populated, governed, managed continent, not an empty wilderness. The political organization of Aboriginal Australia was different from the nation-states and empires that European observers were familiar with. There was no central government, no standing army, no written legal code, no permanent bureaucracy. But there were systems of governance that were effective, stable, and enduring, based on kinship networks, ceremonial obligations, and the shared understanding that the health of the land depended on the responsible behavior of its custodians. The Kulin Nation of Central Victoria provides a well-documented example. The Kulin Nation was a confederation of 5 language groups: the Wurundjeri, Bunurong, Wathaurong, Dja Wurrung and Taungurung, who shared cultural practices, intermarried, and cooperated on matters of mutual interest. The Confederation had mechanisms for resolving disputes, managing shared resources, and coordinating responses to external threats. It was, in every meaningful sense, a political entity, a federation of allied groups with shared governance structures and mutual obligations. Similar confederations and alliances existed across Australia, some of them encompassing dozens of language groups and spanning thousands of square kilometres. The scale and complexity of these political arrangements has been consistently underestimated by non-Aboriginal observers, in part because they did not produce the material evidence, the palaces, the fortifications, the written records that European observers associated with political organization. But the absence of material evidence does not mean the absence of organization. The Aboriginal political systems that governed Australia for 60,000 years were built from relationships, not from stone. They were maintained by conversation, ceremony, and the fulfillment of mutual obligations, not by bureaucratic record keeping. They were encoded in songs and stories, not in constitutions and legal codes, but they were real, they were effective, and they governed the management of an entire continent for longer than any political system in the recorded history of any other part of the world. Number 37, the ochre trade routes, colors that traveled farther than Roman roads. Red ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide pigment, was one of the most valued and widely traded commodities in Aboriginal Australia. It was used for body decoration, ceremonial purposes, rock art, cave painting. the decoration of tools and weapons, and the preparation of burials. Different deposits produce different qualities and colors of ochre, and the most prized deposits were known and exploited across enormous distances. The most famous ochre source in Australia is the Bukartu deposit near Parachilna in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia. The ochre from this deposit, a deep, vivid red, was considered the finest available and was traded across the entire continent. Bukartu ochre has been found at archaeological sites thousands of kilometers from its source. Carried along trade routes that connected the arid interior to the tropical north, the temperate southeast, and the western deserts. The trade routes that carried ochre were among the longest and most enduring in Aboriginal Australia. They connected ecological zones, language groups, and cultural regions that might otherwise have had limited contact, creating channels of communication and exchange that bound the continent together. The ochre trade was not just an economic activity, it was a mechanism for the distribution of information, the maintenance of alliances, and the renewal of intergroup relationships. The distances involved are remarkable. The trade route from Bukartu to the Kimberley in Western Australia covered more than 3,000 kilometers of some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, crossing deserts, mountain ranges, and multiple ecological zones. The journey could not be made by a single individual or group. The ochre moved along the route in stages, passed from group to group in a series of exchanges that might take months or years to complete. Each exchange along the route was embedded in a web of social obligations. The group giving the ochre expected reciprocal gifts, whether of goods, ceremonial knowledge, or social obligations. The group receiving the ochre incurred debts that would be repaid through future exchanges. The cumulative effect of these exchanges was to create a network of mutual obligation that spanned the continent, binding thousands of people into a system of interdependence that was maintained, not by force or by law, but by the shared understanding that the system benefited everyone who participated in it. The ochre trade routes functioned in the same way as the Silk Roads of Central Asia or the trade routes of the Roman Empire, connecting distant regions, facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas, and creating the conditions for cultural cross-fertilization and innovation. The difference is that the ochre routes were older. The evidence for long-distance ochre trade in Australia extends back tens of thousands of years, predating the Silk Road by a factor of 10 or more. And the ochre routes were just one component of the broader trading network that connected Aboriginal Australia. Stone, shells, pituri, possum skins, smoked eels, seeds, fibers, tools, weapons, songs, stories, and ceremonial knowledge all moved along these routes, creating an economy and a communication system that spanned an entire continent and sustained a civilization for longer than any other in human history. Number 38, the silence after. What the landscape sounds like when knowledge stops. There is a sound that a well-managed landscape makes. It is the sound of diversity, of birds calling from a canopy that provides food and shelter, of frogs breeding in wetlands that hold water year-round, of insects humming in grasslands that are maintained at exactly the right stage of growth, of wind moving through trees that have been thinned by careful burning to the density that allows maximum sunlight to reach the forest floor. When Aboriginal fire management ceased, the sound changed. The forests thickened and the understory grew dense and dark. The grasslands were invaded by shrubs and saplings, the wetlands silted up and dried out. The carefully maintained mosaic of habitats that had supported a remarkable diversity of species for thousands of years began to simplify, and the species that depended on that diversity began to decline. The ecological evidence for the impact of the cessation of Aboriginal land management is extensive and growing. Studies across Australia have documented declines in species diversity, changes in vegetation structure, increases in fire severity, and alterations in hydrological patterns that are attributable, at least in part, to the removal of Aboriginal management from the landscape. In some areas, the changes have been dramatic. Landscapes that were open, grassy woodlands at the time of European contact are now dense, impenetrable scrub. Wetlands that once supported rich communities of fish, birds, and aquatic plants are dry or degraded. Grasslands that once fed thousands of people with yam daisies and native grains are now overrun with introduced species or converted to monoculture agriculture. The silence that followed the cessation of Aboriginal land management is not just metaphorical, it is literal. The chorus of birds, frogs, and insects that once filled the air in a well-managed landscape has been replaced in many areas by a muted, simplified soundscape that reflects the loss of habitat diversity and the decline of the species that depended on it. This is perhaps the most devastating consequence of the erasure of Aboriginal civilization. The destruction of the stone cities, the aquaculture systems, and the cultural institutions was a tragedy for Aboriginal people. But the degradation of the landscape that followed the cessation of Aboriginal management is a tragedy for everyone, for every species that depends on the ecological health of the Australian continent, including the species that caused the damage in the first place. The recovery of Aboriginal land management practices is not just a matter of cultural justice, although it is certainly that. It is a matter of ecological necessity. The Australian landscape evolved under Aboriginal management. Its ecological systems are adapted to the specific patterns of fire, water, and disturbance that Aboriginal people maintained for thousands of years. Remove those patterns, and the landscape begins to unravel. Restore them, and there is at least a chance that the damage can be reversed. This is the final lesson of the stone cities. The civilization that built them was not separate from the landscape. It was the landscape. The stone houses, the aquaculture channels, the astronomical observatories, the trade routes, the song lines, the fire regimes, and the ecological management practices were all aspects of a single integrated system, a civilization that was built from the land and that gave back to the land as much as it took. When that civilization was destroyed, the land was damaged too. And until that civilization is recognized, respected, and where possible restored, the damage will continue. That is the story that the stone cities tell. A story of creation, endurance, destruction, and the possibility still of recovery. Now close your eyes. Let your breathing slow and carry this knowledge with you into sleep. The oldest civilization on Earth, built in stone, engineered in water, written in song, and still, despite everything, alive. Good night. But there is one more thing, one more story that deserves to be told before the night takes you. Number 39. The Majid Bebe Shelter and the 65,000-year question, the beginning of everything, in the sandstone escarpment of Western Arnhem Land, overlooking the floodplains of the East Alligator River, there is a rock shelter called Majid Bebe. It is not a dramatic sight. It is a shallow overhang in the rock, open to the air, offering modest shelter from the sun and rain. Hundreds of similar shelters dot the Arnhem Land escarpment. Most of them show evidence of human occupation. But Majid Bebe is different because what archaeologists found in its sediments pushed back the date of human arrival in Australia to at least 65,000 years ago, making it the oldest known site of human habitation outside of Africa. The excavations at Majid Bebe, conducted over several field seasons in the 2010s, uncovered more than 11,000 artifacts in sediments dating to between 65,000 and 80,000 years ago. The artifacts include stone tools, ground ochre, plant remains, and other evidence of a technologically capable and culturally active population. The stone tools include ground edge axes, the oldest known examples of this technology anywhere in the world, suggesting that the first Australians brought with them or quickly developed some of the most advanced stone tool technology of their era. The ground ochre is particularly significant. Ochre is not a tool, it is a pigment used for decoration, ceremony, and symbolic expression. The presence of processed ochre at Majid Bebe at the very beginning of the Australian archaeological record suggests that the first Australians were not simply surviving. They were creating culture, they were making art, they were engaging in symbolic behavior that implies abstract thought, planning, and the communication of ideas through visual media. The dating of the Majid Bebe artifacts was achieved through a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures the time since sediment grains were last exposed to light. The dates have been confirmed by multiple independent analyses and are widely, though not universally, accepted by the archaeological community. Some researchers argue for a more conservative date of around 50,000 years. But even the most conservative estimates make Australia one of the earliest sites of human habitation outside of Africa, and they confirm that the Aboriginal Australian civilization is among the oldest, if not the oldest, continuously existing culture on Earth. The journey from Africa to Australia was not a single dramatic migration. It was a process, probably extending over centuries or millennia, during which successive generations moved slowly eastward through southern and southeastern Asia, island hopping through the Indonesian archipelago, and eventually crossing the sea to reach the Australian New Guinean landmass. Each stage of this journey required the ability to adapt to new environments, develop new technologies, and overcome new challenges, including the sea crossing that brought the first humans to Australian shores. The people who made this journey were not refugees or accidental travelers. They were explorers, pioneers, innovators, the first human beings to colonize an entirely new continent. They carried with them the knowledge, the skills, and the cultural resources that would enable them to build, over the next 65,000 years, the civilization whose remnants we have been discussing throughout this account, and they succeeded. They did not just survive in Australia, they thrived, they populated the entire continent. From the tropical north to the temperate south, from the arid interior to the island-studded coast. They adapted to every environment the continent offered, developing technologies, subsistence strategies, and cultural practices that were precisely tailored to local conditions. They created languages, art, music, ceremony, law, and systems of knowledge that are among the most complex and sophisticated ever developed by human beings. They built stone cities, they engineered waterways, they farmed eels and yam daisies and native grains, they tracked the stars, they navigated by song, they traded across thousands of kilometers. They governed a continent through kinship and ceremony. They managed the landscape with fire, and they did all of this for 65,000 years, longer than any other civilization in the history of the human species. That is the story, the full, unabridged, unflinching story of the stone cities of Australia. Not a story of an empty continent waiting to be discovered. A story of a continent that was already full, already managed, already civilized, already old beyond the comprehension of the people who came to take it. Number 40. What you can do with what you now know. You have just listened to 2 hours of history that most people will never hear, not because it is hidden, but because it requires a willingness to look at the evidence and follow it where it leads, even when the destination is uncomfortable. The stone cities of Australia are not a mystery. They are not a conspiracy theory. They are not an alternative history. They are the actual history, documented by archaeologists, confirmed by dating techniques, corroborated by oral traditions, and visible in the physical landscape for anyone who takes the time to look. The mystery is not the cities. The mystery is why it took so long for anyone to see them. If this story moved you, if it changed the way you think about Australia, about history, about civilization, then share it. Tell someone, because the most powerful force that erased the stone cities was not disease or violence or greed. It was silence. The simple, everyday refusal to acknowledge what was obvious. And the most powerful force that can bring them back into view is exactly the opposite. Talking about them, remembering them, refusing to let the silence continue. The oldest civilization on Earth built its cities in stone, engineered its waterways in basalt, wrote its histories in song, mapped its world in stars, and sustained its people for 65,000 years on the oldest continent on Earth. And now you know. That is something worth carrying with you into the quiet hours of the night. A piece of the story that the world forgot and that you now remember. Sleep well. And one final thought. One last thing before the stillness settles in. There is a Gunditjmara word, Bujbim, that names the volcano around which an entire civilization was built. The word does not just mean volcano. It carries within it the memory of the eruption itself, the moment when the earth opened and fire poured across the landscape, the moment when destruction created the conditions for everything that came after. The basalt that cooled from that lava became the stone from which houses were built. Channels were carved and weirs were constructed. The destruction of the old landscape made possible the creation of the new one. There is something in that idea that feels relevant to the present moment. The civilization that was built at Buj Bim was nearly destroyed. The stone houses were pulled apart. The channels were filled in. The people were displaced. But the knowledge did not entirely disappear. The Gunditjmara survived. They carried the memory of their civilization through the darkest period in their history, through dispossession, disease, and the systematic suppression of everything they knew and everything they were. And now they are rebuilding, not from scratch, but from the foundations that survived, the knowledge that was carried, the stories that were told in whispers when the mission authorities were not listening, the skills that were practiced in secret, the connections to country that were maintained even when the law said they could not be. The stone cities of Australia were nearly erased, but nearly is not completely. And the same resilience that sustained a civilization for 65,000 years through ice ages and droughts and volcanic eruptions and sea level changes is sustaining it still. The oldest civilization on Earth has survived the most sustained assault on its existence that any culture has ever faced, and it is still here. That is not a sad story, that is an extraordinary one. A story of endurance that has no parallel in human history. A story of knowledge so deep and so durable that even 2 centuries of deliberate destruction could not entirely erase it. A story of people who held on to who they were, even when every force in the world was trying to make them forget. The stone cities of Australia were real. Some of them still exist, buried and broken, but still present in the landscape, still carrying the evidence of what was built here on this continent by people whose descendants are still alive, still fighting, still remembering. And now you are part of that remembering too. Close your eyes. Let the weight of 65,000 years of human history settle around you like a blanket. Let the knowledge you have gained tonight become part of the way you see the world. The oldest stories are not in books, they are in stone and song and the memory of the land itself. The stone cities are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time. They can wait a little longer, but perhaps after tonight, they will not have to wait alone. Good night, and thank you for listening. The wind moves across the volcanic plains tonight, the same wind that moved across them 30,000 years ago when the lava was still cooling and the first stone walls were being laid. The stars turn overhead, the same stars that the Wathaurong tracked from Wurdi the same emu in the sky that told the old people when to look for eggs. The eels are still moving in the waterways, following the same paths they have followed for millennia, swimming through channels that were carved by hands that understood the water better than any engineer alive today. The land remembers even when the people are told to forget. The stones remember even when they are scattered. The songs remember even when they are sung in whispers. And tonight you remember too. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. Sleep now. The stone cities will still be there in the morning. They have been there for 6,000 years. They are not going anywhere, and neither, despite everything, are the people who built them. Good night. And if you are still awake, still listening, still here in the quiet after the story has been told, then know this. You have just heard the longest story ever told about the oldest civilization ever built. A civilization of stone and water and fire and song. A civilization that lasted 65,000 years and was nearly destroyed in 200. A civilization that is still alive, still fighting, still remembering, still rebuilding, stone by stone, song by song, fire by fire, in the oldest country on earth. Remember it. That is all anyone has ever asked. Just remember.